Hey, guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Egyptians didn't treat sex like a scandal. They treated it like plumbing, necessary, functional, and ideally without too many blockages. In ancient Egyptian society, sex wasn't hidden behind closed doors, hushed whispers, or uncomfortable euphemisms. It was part of nature, like the sun rising, the Nile flooding, or cats doing whatever they wanted. The gods did it. The farmers did it. The nobles did it. And crucially, no one felt the need to invent shame about it. The culture didn't frame sexuality as something dirty or dangerous. In fact, it was sacred, tied to creation, fertility, health, and personal pleasure. Not necessarily in that order. This wasn't hedonism. It was balanced. Egyptian society ran on the principle of Ma'at, cosmic harmony, and sexuality was part of maintaining that harmony. Fertility meant crops. Crops meant food. Food meant survival. So if your sex life was healthy, the gods were probably smiling. If not, well, maybe it was time to light a candle to Hathor and consider using more honey. This open attitude filtered into everything: art, literature, medicine, even architecture. Temples featured carvings of fertility gods. Homes were often built with private areas for intimacy. And yes, ancient architects had enough tact to know that love doesn't flourish next to granaries. And unlike many later societies, ancient Egypt didn't obsess over celibacy or punish people for having sex unless it involves property disputes or someone else's wife. There were no mass puritanical movements, no complex hierarchies based on who did or didn't do what with whom. Your social value wasn't chained to what you did in bed. It was tied more to how much land you had, how good your grain harvest was, and whether you kept your linen white in the sun. If you're wondering why sex was treated with such casual sacredness in ancient Egypt, you can thank the gods who, frankly, set the tone by making it part of their divine job descriptions. Let's begin with Adam, the original solo act. According to the Heliopolitan creation myth, Adam created the world by engaging in an act of, let's say, enthusiastic self-involvement. No partner, no help, just pure determination and cosmic alone time. From this, he produced Shu-air and Tefnut moisture, which means the Egyptian universe literally began with a one-god show and bodily fluids. This wasn't scandalous, it was revered. Adam's generative act was seen as power, a divine assertion that life starts with desire. No need for fig leaves or awkward silence. The gods didn't blush. Why should anyone else? Next up, Osiris and Isis. Ancient Egypt's royal couple. When Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis, determined and very committed, reassembled his body. All of it. Well, almost all. One crucial part was missing. So what did she do? She crafted a substitute phallus. Yes, with magic. Revived him long enough to conceive Horus, and voila, the divine bloodline continued. That's love. An excellent time management. Then there's Min, the god of fertility and male potency. He was often depicted standing tall in every sense, crowned with lettuce, holding his most recognizable feature proudly in hand. Ancient statues didn't leave much to the imagination. Shrines to Min featured ritual lettuce offerings symbolizing fertility, and, well, lettuce was kind of their Viagra Hathor. The goddess of love, music, and drunken joy was another sensual figure. Often nude or semi-nude in depictions, she represented everything pleasurable about human connection, dancing, desire, laughter, and seduction. Festivals in her honor were essentially ancient Tinder with tambourines. Even the sun god Ra had moments of reproductive importance, though usually involving creation through speech or spitting, which is only slightly less weird than Adam's solo performance. The gods modeled sexuality as divine, necessary, and sometimes a little experimental. They didn't separate the sacred from the sensual. They merged them. Not every Egyptian was crafting magical phalluses or offering sacred lettuce to the god of fertility. Most were just normal people with normal relationships, trying to find time for intimacy between feeding the livestock and avoiding crocodiles. Unlike their more dramatic gods and occasionally incestuous royalty, the average Egyptian's love life was pretty down to earth. If you were a farmer, a potter, or a linen worker, chances are your romantic endeavors revolved around who lived nearby, who made good beer, and who still had all their teeth by age 30. Standards, but reasonable relationships were built on shared labor, shared meals, and ideally, shared affection. Couples slept in the same bed, raised children together, and even snuck the occasional love note onto a potsherd. Yes, literal shards of pottery with messages like "I dream of your beauty by night." That's ancient texting, folks. Sex wasn't regulated by priests or political decrees. As long as it was consensual and not interfering with your work or someone else's marriage contract, it was your business. Privacy might have been limited, walls were thin, and nosy neighbors were eternal, but intimacy was respected. For many couples, physical affection wasn't hidden. Tomb paintings sometimes showed husbands and wives touching tenderly, holding hands or standing face to face, and not in the purely ceremonial kind of way. These were people who genuinely valued connection. The Egyptians also understood timing. Fertility mattered a lot. The Nile flooded predictably. Crops had seasons, and so did the human body. Women knew their cycles. Men had herbal tonics, and everyone had at least one grandmother with unsolicited advice involving honey and onions. Contraception, while not foolproof, was part of life. So was midwifery. There were even pregnancy tests involving barley and emmet seeds if they sprouted after being peed on. Congratulations. If not, maybe next year. And if things didn't work out romantically, divorce was possible. No trials, no public shaming. Just a split of property and a return to separate bread ovens. If you're imagining ancient Egyptian weddings with veils, bouquets, and uncomfortable uncles doing the crocodile dance, you might want to scale it back a lot. The truth is, in ancient Egypt, getting married was a delightfully low effort. All you needed was a house, some bread, and mutual tolerance. A shared bed didn't hurt either. There was no ceremony, no priest, no registry office, number 47 plate catering menu with chicken, lamb, or divine mystery stew. If two people agreed to live together and shared resources, food, linens, maybe a goat, society accepted them as married. Just like that, done. No wedding dresses either. Women wore the same linen garments they wore every other day. Usually white, sometimes pleated, always breathable. No rings, no vows, no emotional groomsmen with speech scrolls. Ancient Egyptian relationships didn't need pageantry. They needed practicality. You got chores to do after all. Bali's not going to thresh itself. That said, couples did sometimes write up marriage contracts, especially in later periods. These were basically ancient prenups. Who brings what into the household? Who keeps what if things go sideways? Occasionally, the contracts even spelled out penalties for bad behavior. If you hit me, you owe me silver. Not quite romantic, but very efficient. The marriage contracts also reinforced women's rights, something ancient Egypt was surprisingly advanced about. Women could own property, initiate divorce, and take ex-husbands to court if they tried anything funny. If love was blind, Egyptian law most definitely wasn't. There wasn't a honeymoon per se, unless you count collapsing after a big feast and hoping no neighbors overheard the fun. But intimacy, affection, and companionship were clearly valued. Marriage wasn't just a transaction, it was a partnership. Ideally, let's get this out of the way. Ancient Egyptians valued fidelity, especially in theory. In practice, things were a little more flexible, particularly if you were wealthy, powerful, or had very convincing excuses. Adultery, like many social sins, wasn't always a criminal offense. For everyday folks, it was more of a reputational hazard than a legal disaster. If you got caught cheating, people would talk loudly, and probably inversely. But unless someone's livestock or inheritance was directly affected, the government wasn't rushing in to punish your escapades. However, if you were a married woman caught in adultery, the consequences could be harsher, socially and economically, if not legally. Egyptian society was patriarchal, but not aggressively so, and a woman's fidelity was often tied to questions of paternity, inheritance, and her general standing as someone who didn't cause chaos during harvest season. Accusations of infidelity could lead to divorce, public shame, and in rare cases, punishment like beatings or banishment, particularly in elite households where family honor was a full-time job. Men, meanwhile, had more wiggle room. A married man sleeping with an unmarried woman, mostly shrugged off. A married man with another married woman. Now that was messy, especially if the other husband was important and not into sharing. Jealousy has never been confined to any one century. Texts from the New Kingdom mention moral expectations and the importance of a good reputation. In some stories, adulterers are described as foolish or dishonorable, while others suggest that a man who sleeps with another man's wife will have a tragic fate, usually involving curses, impotence, or angry gods with jackal head still. The absence of strict laws against adultery in most periods is telling. The Egyptians didn't feel the need to legislate every affair. They relied more on shame, gossip, and the occasional passive-aggressive song lyric. It worked about as well as you'd expect. If a marriage broke down due to infidelity, the divorce process wasn't overly complicated. Property would be split, and the community would collectively pretend they weren't watching with interest. Children typically stayed with a mother, especially if they were young. If your first reaction to hearing that Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters is a horrified wait, what? You're not alone. Most modern humans respond the same way. But in ancient Egypt, sibling marriage among royalty wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Romantic. Not really. Politics. Absolutely. To understand this eyebrow-raising tradition, you have to think like a pharaoh. Imagine you believe your family is descended from gods, and not in a metaphorical divine right way, but literally. If the gods married their siblings to maintain cosmic order, then obviously the royal family should do the same. Because nothing says eternal stability like awkward family reunions that double as wedding receptions. This wasn't about attraction. It was about power consolidation. Pharaohs didn't want outsiders, even noble ones, gaining access to the throne. Marrying a sister or half-sister kept the bloodline pure and the assets in-house. Essentially, royal Egypt ran on a combination of divine mythology and dynastic trust issues. Some of the most famous pharaohs followed this tradition. Tutankhamun, for example, was born from a brother-sister union, a fact confirmed by modern DNA analysis, and spoiler alert, it didn't turn out great. Tut had numerous congenital issues, including a clubfoot and a fragile immune system, which might suggest that repeating the family tree too many times comes with consequences. Meanwhile, commoners were not partaking in this trend. Most regular Egyptians married outside their immediate families, like same functioning people. Cousin marriage occasionally happened in rural areas, but brother-sister unions were strictly for the folks with gold masks and burial boats. Even among royals, the practice could cause problems. When Cleopatra, yes, that Cleopatra took the throne, she technically married her brothers, plural as per custom, but she ruled largely alone and later aligned herself with men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, who were not thankfully related to her. To us, the whole concept seems bizarre, and yes, medically unwise. But to the ancient Egyptian elite, it was simply tradition wrapped in God-complex logic. Divine bloodlines had to stay divine, even if it meant sacrificing variety in the royal gene pool. If you assume all ancient Egyptian art was solemn statues, stiff postures, and endless profile views, you're technically right, unless you've seen the Turin erotic papyrus. Then you realize, they had jokes and very detailed anatomy. While Egyptian art is mostly known for its restraint, stoic pharaohs, serene gods, perfectly symmetrical profile faces, the culture wasn't immune to cheekiness. Sex, after all, wasn't taboo. So occasionally the artists stopped carving falcons and started sketching something a bit more animated. The most infamous example is Turin Papyrus, now tucked away in an Italian museum like a naughty secret. It's believed to date to around 1150 BCE, and it contains explicit scenes, not vague mythological winks. We're talking graphic illustrations of men and women, including one gentleman balancing acrobatically on amphory, which is either symbolic or just showing off. Scholars debate whether it was satire, erotica, or a combination of both. Some think it was made to entertain, possibly even a bachelor's gift for someone with questionable taste. Others suggest it was a parody, an artistic prank poking fun at how obsessed people were with fertility, virility, and large wigs. Aside from this outlier, most Egyptian erotic art was symbolic, not explicit. Temples didn't have Kama Sutra frescoes. They had fertility motifs, sacred imagery, and occasional nudes representing rebirth, creation, or divine femininity. Goddesses like Hathor and fertility deities like Min were often shown nude, but in a reverent way. Min, for instance, is always depicted standing tall, if you catch the drift, holding his signature symbol like a divine badge of honor. Then there's the use of humor and sexuality in marginal drawings, animals behaving like people, exaggerated gestures, and flirty little side sketches on workers' ostraca. Limestone flakes used like sticky notes, the ancient equivalent of doodling in your notebook when the foreman wasn't looking. Eroticism in Egyptian art wasn't meant to scandalize. It was simply another part of life, occasionally celebrated, often ritualized, and sometimes hilariously over the top. These weren't repressed people. They just had an excellent sense of boundaries, and occasionally a day where they decided the scroll needed spice. If your idea of ancient love poetry is stiff, chiseled metaphors like your beauty is like a grain silo, think again. The Egyptians may have carved hieroglyphs into stone, but their romantic writing was anything but rigid. These people knew how to flirt with ink, with style, and occasionally with absolutely no chill preserved on papyri and broken pottery shards. Because nothing says eternal love like a reused cereal bowl, Egyptian love poems date mostly to the New Kingdom period, around 1300 BCE, and they are refreshingly honest, surprisingly passionate, and occasionally so steamy you'd think they were written during a Nile flood with nothing better to do. Here's a genuine line from one: "I shall lie down at home and pretend to be sick. Then you will come and see me, and if you come near me, I will get better." This isn't vague romanticism. This is flirtation with a plan. Both men and women compose these poems, often from a first-person perspective. That's rare for the ancient world. In Egypt, the young woman could describe the thrill of sneaking glances across the lotus pond. The young man could wax poetic about how her voice was better than beer. That's the kind of devotion that deserves a monument. These weren't private diary entries either. Some of them were performed at banquets, read aloud for entertainment, courtship, or just to fill awkward silences between harp solos. Imagine ancient Tinder dates with live readings of passionate stanzas, followed by wine and maybe a goat roast, and the metaphors. Oh, they went all in. Fruit symbolized sensuality. Hunting meant pursuit and seduction. Gardens and rivers were, well, not always about agriculture. These poems weren't afraid to mix earthy, grounded affection with cosmic-level adoration. Desire wasn't something to be repressed. It was to be sung about, written down, and possibly recited by that one cousin who always read too slowly. When you think of aphrodisiacs, you probably imagine oysters, chocolate, or wine, not salad. But in ancient Egypt, if someone brought you a bouquet of lettuce, they weren't thinking about fiber. They were flirting. Specifically, they were invoking the power of Min, the Egyptian god of fertility, who, for reasons that are equal parts symbolic and suspicious, was closely associated with romaine lettuce. Yes, romaine. Not just your average Caesar garnish. This stuff was sacred. The reason? Well, unlike the floppy leaf varieties we toss in sad lunch bowls today, Egyptian lettuce stood upright and oozed a milky white sapid when cut. And if that didn't trigger some highly suggestive divine symbolism, nothing would. Ancient priests looked at that and thought, now that is clearly the embodiment of male potency. Naturally, lettuce was regularly offered to men during fertility rituals. His statues typically featured him in a, let's say, alert state, holding his signature attribute in one hand and a lettuce stalk in the other. Art historians have had a field day with that pairing for centuries. At fertility festivals, worshippers would present bundles of lettuce at his temple, hoping to gain his favor for increased virility, a healthy pregnancy, or just a bit of romantic luck. Min was basically the ancient Egyptian version of a dating app algorithm. Worship him correctly, and your chances might improve. Interestingly, there's evidence that the lettuce was also believed to have medicinal properties, particularly for promoting sexual health. Whether it actually worked or just led to fresher breath before a date is debatable, but the symbolism stuck. And this wasn't just a passing trend. Lettuce appears in art, hieroglyphics, and even offerings in tombs, as if to say, please ensure I continue enjoying pleasure in the afterlife, and maybe pack a salad. It's worth noting that the ancient Egyptians were big fans of natural symbolism. From the Nile's life-giving floods to the lotus flower's daily blooming cycle, the physical world mirrored their spiritual beliefs. So when a vegetable starts acting a little extra, you best believe it got promoted to mystical status. When it came to preventing pregnancy, the ancient Egyptians employed methods that were imaginative, herbal, and occasionally alarming. Without access to modern science, they relied on natural substances, accumulated wisdom, and texts like the Ebers Papyrus, one of the earliest surviving medical documents dating to around 1550 BCE. One of the more infamous prescriptions involved crocodile dung mixed with honey and sourdough. This concoction was inserted vaginally as a form of barrier contraceptive. While modern readers may recoil, the idea was not entirely without logic. The mixture likely created an acidic or obstructive environment. Whether it was effective is unclear. Whether it was unpleasant is easier to guess. More promising was the use of acacia gum, a plant extract that, as later science confirmed, ferments into lactic acid, a compound that does in fact have spermicidal qualities. Combined with other ingredients like honey and dates, it formed a kind of early pessary. It's one of the few ancient remedies that could arguably pass a very lenient clinical trial. These methods suggest that Egyptian women, who had notable legal and medical agency for the time, took active roles in managing reproduction. The use of these materials would have been common knowledge among midwives, healers, and women within the household. There were also ritual and spiritual approaches. Women might appeal to fertility deities like Isis, Hathor, or Bes, seeking either conception or its delay. Magical amulets and incantations were used alongside practical remedies, blurring the line between medicine and religion, as was typical in most aspects of Egyptian life. In addition to preventing pregnancy, Egyptian medical texts contain instructions for inducing menstruation, treating infertility, and even early pregnancy detection using barley and emmer grains exposed to urine, a method surprisingly accurate in some cases. In the absence of modern tools, these practices reveal a culture deeply invested in understanding and influencing the human body. They lacked microscopes, but not intention. Fertility was a matter of life, death, economics, and divine favor. And while some of their methods may now seem outlandish, the impulse behind them to plan, to protect, to prepare is strikingly familiar. In ancient Egypt, virginity wasn't a badge of honor, a social currency, or a fragile family heirloom to be guarded at all costs. In fact, it wasn't really a big deal at all. More like a passing footnote in the grander narrative of life, which mostly revolved around crops, inheritance, and not angering the gods before breakfast. There's no known Egyptian word for virgin in a moralistic ceremonial sense. The closest you'll find are terms that mean young woman or uninitiated, which is less purity culture and more hasn't had a time yet. No torches were lit, no ceremonies performed, and no mothers-in-law inspecting linens like they were looking for counterfeit currency. This wasn't because the Egyptians were scandalous libertines. It's just that they had a far more functional approach to sex. It was seen as part of life, like eating bread or avoiding hippos. Important, yes, sacred sometimes, but nothing that required a purity certificate stamped by a temple priest. For women, value came from things like fertility, loyalty, and whether she could run a household without the roof catching fire. Her sexual history, mostly her business. Marriage wasn't about sealing a chaste deal. It was about forming a reliable alliance that could ideally survive tax season and plagues. Of course, modesty existed. People didn't walk around advertising their conquests on papyrus scrolls, but the kind of ritual obsession with virginity found in later societies just didn't materialize here. No cloistering, no dowries based on moral performance, no uncles making awkward speeches about virtue. Even Egyptian religion offered little support for the whole purity panic. The goddess Hathor, patron of love, music, and wine, was openly sensual and extremely unbothered by anyone's opinions. The gods were far too busy managing creation and cosmic balance to weigh in on who had done what, when, and with whom. In the end, virginity in ancient Egypt was treated for what it is, a temporary condition, not a lifelong resume. And frankly, they seem more concerned with who could bake good bread and whether your father had a reliable roof to offer. Because when you live in a desert surrounded by crocodiles, you learn pretty quickly what really matters and what absolutely doesn't. Ancient Egyptian society didn't publish rainbow flags or hold parades, but it also didn't seem particularly troubled by the existence of same-sex relationships. There were no official laws condemning them, no public stonings, and most tellingly, no frenzied temple sermons about the end of civilization brought on by two men sharing a bedroll. In short, they noticed, but didn't panic. The most discussed example is that of Nyanknum and Numhotep, two high-ranking officials buried together in a shared tomb at Saqqara. Their tomb features intimate artwork, the pair embracing touching noses, a gesture equivalent to a kiss, and generally behaving like a couple whose biggest argument was probably about linen colors. The inscriptions refer to them as overseers of the manicurists, which sounds innocuous until you realize they were clearly close enough to be buried as one household unit. Were they lovers? Roommates with exceptional boundaries? Brothers unusually fond of holding hands? Scholars still debate, but the visual language leans heavily in favor of a romantic, or at least deeply affectionate bond. And the fact that their tomb exists, beautifully decorated, publicly visible, suggests that nobody was outraged. They were important, respected, and apparently allowed to be themselves, even in death. Egyptian texts and mythology also leave space for fluidity. Some deities, like Hapi, god of the Nile, are depicted as intersex or androgynous. Others take on dual roles or switch genders in mythological tales without causing divine HR complaints. The gods, it seems, were not limited by human categories, and neither were the people invoking them. That said, there's no evidence of organized same-sex marriages or political recognition of same-gender unions. Egyptians were pragmatic. If a relationship produced heirs and property stability, great. If it didn't, well, that was your household's business. Intimacy, as always, was treated with a curious mix of privacy and normalcy. And while male same-sex relations are more visible in the records, female ones are almost completely absent. Not because they didn't happen, but because Egyptian scribes had a frustrating habit of ignoring what women did when no men were around. In ancient Egypt, having children wasn't just desirable. It was a social expectation, a spiritual duty, and if you were lucky, a way to ensure someone would refill your tomb offerings long after you were gone. So when a couple struggled to conceive, it wasn't brushed aside. It was investigated medically, magically, and sometimes both in the same afternoon. The ancient Egyptians approached infertility with characteristic pragmatism. Their medical papyri, particularly the Kahin Gynecological Papyrus dating to around 1800 BCE, include detailed diagnoses, treatments, and methods for evaluating female fertility. There were instructions for examining cervical mucus, monitoring cycles, and even a primitive pregnancy test involving urinating on barley and emma wheat. If the grains sprouted, congratulations. Your household was about to get louder. If not, the next step might involve inserting herbal mixtures, fumigating the womb. Yes, really? Or appealing to higher powers? Because in Egypt, if medicine didn't work, magic was always available and often recommended. Amulets played a central role. Symbols of Hathor, Isis, Bears or Tauret, the hippo-shaped protector of childbirth, were worn, carried, or placed under pillows. Spells were recited. Figurines were buried or cradled. One text suggests that to conceive, a woman should drink a concoction of ground dates, honey, and carob while reciting a protective charm. Not FDA approved, but deeply heartfelt. Men, of course, weren't off the hook, though far fewer papyri bothered to question their reproductive contributions in cases of persistent infertility. A man might be told to undergo purification rituals, consult a priest, or, in less official advice, simply try harder. And because this was Egypt, cosmic order modeled, that was always part of the equation. A childless couple might be seen as unbalanced or even cursed, but society didn't shun them. It offered remedies, hope, and a few very creative prescriptions. It's worth noting that despite all this effort, Egyptian households weren't necessarily overflowing with children. High infant mortality, disease, and malnutrition kept family sizes smaller than ideal, which only made fertility all the more sacred and its absence all the more personal. If you think desire fades after death, the ancient Egyptians would like a word and possibly a carefully carved offering slab. In their worldview, death wasn't an end. It was a continuation of life. Ideally, with all the comforts, pleasures, and daily routines of the living world, including sex, funerary texts, tomb inscriptions, and grave goods, all suggest that the deceased hope to carry their appetites into the afterlife, not just for bread and beer, but for love, touch, and intimacy. Because, frankly, what's the point of eternal life if it doesn't include a bit of pleasure? Tomb art often depicted couples embracing, holding hands or standing intimately close, not just for sentiment, but as a spiritual blueprint. These weren't generic stock poses. They were deliberate messages to the gods. Please restore our bodies, our love, and if possible, our bedroom privileges. And yes, bodily restoration was a serious concern. In the Book of the Dead and other mortuary texts, the dead are promised their limbs will function. Their hearts will be weighed fairly, and their, let's say, equipment will be returned intact. There are even references to revivifying certain parts of the anatomy. Note detail was considered too personal for eternity. Sexuality was tied to rebirth. The god Osiris, famously dismembered and reassembled by Isis, was revived, including a reconstructed phallus. Before fathering Horus, this myth wasn't just legend. It was a template. If the gods resumed intimacy after resurrection, so should the rest of us. Some tomb inscriptions even included requests to the gods for continued love between husband and wife in the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. It was envisioned as a lush, idealized version of earthly life, fertile land, calm waters, eternal abundance, and evidently room for romance. While modern cultures often compartmentalize sex as earthly and mortal, the Egyptians folded it seamlessly into their afterlife ideology. It wasn't shameful or forgotten. It was another part of the soul's well-being, like food, music, and not having to pay taxes ever again. In the end, they hoped for what most people still do: comfort, companionship, and a little joy, even if it took mummification and a few magical scrolls to get there. When we peel back the linen wrappings of ancient Egypt, metaphorically of course, what we find is a civilization that didn't treat the human body as something shameful, sinful, or suspicious. It was seen as natural, powerful, and capable of both divine creation and very human desire. Sex, for the Egyptians, was not a secret to be hidden. It was a fact of life, discussed in poems, depicted in art, sometimes vividly, and written into the very myths that shaped their worldview. Gods themselves fell in love, flirted, seduced, and occasionally caused fertility-related chaos across the Nile. In a culture where existence flowed from cycles, the flooding of the river, the return of the sun, the rebirth of the soul, sexuality was part of that rhythm, not an interruption of it. They also took a practical approach. From contraception and fertility treatments to love songs and afterlife desires, the Egyptians faced physicality head-on, often with more clarity than many societies that came centuries later. There was no hysterical legislation, no moral panic, no need for uncomfortable censorship scribbled in the margins of sacred texts. Just a clear understanding. Bodies do things, people feel things, and the world keeps turning. Importantly, they didn't overthink it. Sex wasn't put on a pedestal, nor was it dragged through the mud. It was part of health, love, family, and sometimes religion, worthy of respect, but not surrounded by neurosis. Even their gods, powerful and eternal, didn't shy away from physical form or intimacy. In fact, they embodied it. And while not every practice holds up today, we're looking at you, Crocodile Dome. The attitude remains refreshingly modern. Or perhaps modernity has just taken 3,000 years to catch up, and maybe that's the legacy worth remembering. A culture that didn't fear the body, didn't vilify desire, and somehow still managed to build pyramids on top of it all. It was August 24th, 1814, and Washington, D.C. was burning. Columns of smoke choked the night sky as British soldiers torched the most symbolic buildings in a young republic: the Capitol, the Treasury, the War Office, and the President's Mansion, later to be called the White House. Flames licked the rooftops as the redcoats walked through the city almost casually, facing no organized resistance. The Capitol, barely a teenager in political years, was defenseless. The humiliation was complete. The world watched in disbelief, and America blushed with shame. But to understand how things got this bad, you have to rewind a bit. 2 years earlier, the United States had declared war on Great Britain, filled with confidence and grand illusions. The Americans thought the war would be swift and glorious, that they'd invade Canada, defeat the British, and finally earn global respect. After all, Britain was already exhausted fighting Napoleon in Europe. Surely they wouldn't have the energy to bother with a scrappy ex-colony acting tough. They were wrong. Not only did the invasion of Canada fail miserably, but the U.S. Navy's few successes couldn't make up for repeated land defeats. Political divisions inside America made matters worse. Some states didn't want the war at all. Supplies were short, strategy was confused. And worst of all, the British never forgot by 1814. Napoleon was defeated, and Britain had a clear calendar. With veteran troops now available, they turned their full attention across the Atlantic, and they were ready to send a message, one that would sear itself into the American psyche for generations. Washington, D.C. wasn't just targeted for military reasons. It was symbolic, the seat of power, the pride of the Republic. And on that humid August day, it was left almost completely undefended, because no one really believed the British would dare strike it directly. The irony, they didn't just dare. They planned it down to the minute. What unfolded wasn't a battle. It was a torchlit parade of revenge, a reminder that the British Empire, despite the revolution, still had the power to humiliate its former colonies. And as the flames engulfed the House of Representatives and smoke blackened the dome of the Capitol, America had to ask itself a painful question. Had they underestimated the empire they once defied? The British didn't just appear in Washington by magic. Their road to the capital was shockingly easy because the Americans practically opened the door for them. Their landing point was Benedict, Maryland, a sleepy town on the Patuxent River. From there, seasoned British Major General Robert Ross led roughly 4,500 troops, many of them veterans fresh from the Napoleonic Wars on a march toward Washington. And it wasn't a desperate push through enemy territory. No, it was more like a Sunday hike. Why? Because the Americans barely tried to stop them. President James Madison and his government knew the British were coming. They had time. Warnings had come from scouts and even civilians. But bureaucracy, indecision, and just plain wishful thinking led to a sluggish and chaotic defense. Secretary of War John Armstrong Jr., in a moment of genius-level denial, insisted the British wouldn't dare attack Washington. They'll go for Baltimore, he claimed repeatedly. Spoiler, they didn't. Brigadier General William Winder was the man in charge of stopping the British advance. Unfortunately, Winder was better at writing reports than leading troops. His hastily assembled defense force consisted of militiamen, many untrained, undisciplined, and some reportedly drunk. The professional soldiers he had were too few. Worse, Winder hesitated. He kept pulling back instead of digging in, unsure where the British would strike. The two forces finally met on August 24th at the Battle of Bladensburg, just northeast of Washington. American forces outnumbered the British, but that didn't matter. The battle was a total fiasco. Militiamen broke ranks and fled before firing a shot. Some simply dropped their weapons and ran. President Madison himself was on the field briefly, then wisely decided to not die with the amateurs. The British, stunned by the ease of victory, pressed forward. No trenches to overcome, no burning barricades, no desperate defense of the capital. Just a straight shot into the city. It was a comedy of errors, but no one was laughing. By the time the British reached Washington, American leadership had dissolved into chaos. Madison fled. Government documents were being stuffed into carts. First Lady Dolly Madison, refusing to abandon the White House without dignity, packed up valuables, including Gilbert Stuart's now famous portrait of George Washington. As night fell, the Redcoats marched in, and the match was almost ready to be lit. By the time the British entered Washington, the city was nearly deserted. Politicians had fled. The streets were quiet, eerily so. The only sounds were the boots of British soldiers and the soft crackle of fires already smoldering from earlier skirmishes. Major General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn led their men with clinical precision. No looting, no chaos, just a disciplined mission to make a statement. And what a statement it was. The British troops began with the Capitol building. It was still under construction, but the north and south wings, the chambers of Congress, were complete enough to symbolize the pride and function of the American government. The British set fire to both wings. Flames engulfed the Library of Congress. The books and manuscripts, some irreplaceable, went up in smoke. It wasn't just a military blow, it was a cultural one. Next, they moved to the White House. Then known as the President's Mansion, Dolly Madison had already fled, but not before rescuing that now iconic portrait of George Washington. British troops found the building empty, but dinner was laid out on the table untouched. In what might be history's most awkward meal, British officers sat down and enjoyed the president's dinner before torching the place. They were deliberate, almost ceremonial in the destruction of Cockburn, who had a personal score to settle with the Americans for mocking him in political cartoons, reportedly made a point of burning the offices of anti-British newspapers and even stood atop the speaker's chair in a House of Representatives, declaring mockingly, "Shall this harbor of Yankee democracy be burned? Oh yes, it shall." Over the course of 2 days, building after building was put to the torch. The Treasury, the War Department, the Navy Yard, the Arsenal. Even the bridge across the Potomac was burned to prevent counterattacks. Yet despite the thoroughness, some sites were spared. The Patent Office, for instance, was saved because one brave American, William Thornton, convinced the British that it served all mankind, not just the U.S. government. The destruction wasn't random. It was surgical, and it was meant to humiliate. The British weren't trying to conquer Washington. They were trying to shame him. And with each building that collapsed in flames, their message grew louder. This wasn't just a raid. It was a punishment. And the smoke would linger far beyond the ashes. Just as the British settled into their fiery conquest of Washington, something strange happened. The sky darkened. Winds picked up. Then came the thunder. A violent, freakish storm, what some later called hurricane, slammed into the Capitol. It was as if nature herself had decided the city had suffered enough. Torrential rain poured down, extinguishing many of the fires the British had set. High winds tore roofs off buildings and even lifted cannons off the ground. A British soldier was reportedly crushed by flying debris. The storm grew so intense that British officers began to fear it was a divine judgment, a punishment for burning a defenseless city. And then, almost prophetically, the tornado ripped through the heart of D.C. Yes, a literal tornado. It tore through the center of town, flinging carts and debris like matchsticks. Buildings collapsed, trees snapped in half, and British soldiers were thrown to the ground, confused and shaken. The British command, already preparing to leave, took this as a clear sign. Their message had been delivered. To stay longer might be tempting fate. They pulled out of the city the next day, their mission complete and their boots barely dry. For Washington, the storm was both a curse and a blessing. On one hand, it caused even more destruction, ripping apart already damaged structures and flooding the streets. On the other hand, it helped extinguish the flames and may have prevented the complete destruction of the city. It quite literally washed away the British presence. In the minds of many Americans, this storm took on near mythical status. Clergy declared it an act of divine intervention. Editorials praised them. Hand of providence. Even hardened soldiers whispered that God had stepped in to protect the Capitol when man had failed to do so. Of course, nature doesn't take sides. The storm didn't rebuild the city or restore lost lives, but symbolically, it marked a turning point. The fires were out, the British were gone, and what remained, smoking ruins, wet ash, shattered pride, was still American. The storm became a strange kind of salvation. In the absence of military strength, Washington had been spared by something else, something uncontrollable, unpredictable, and perhaps in its own way redemptive. The worst was over. But rebuilding the soul of a nation, that was just the beginning. The British had left. The fires were out. The storm had passed. But what they left behind wasn't just ash and rubble. It was psychological devastation. Washington, D.C. lay in ruin. The Capitol was a blackened shell. The president's mansion was little more than a scorched frame. Government offices were gutted, their contents scattered or destroyed. For many Americans, especially those in the Capitol, the destruction felt like a second revolution. Except this time, it was the enemy who marched through triumphantly. The nation faced a haunting question. Should Washington remain the capital? Many believed it was over. The argument seemed logical. Washington had always been a compromise, built in a swampy patch of nowhere to appease southern states. Now, after being embarrassed and burned to the ground, it looked like a failed experiment. Some in Congress pushed for relocation. Philadelphia, New York, or even Baltimore could serve better. Cities with actual defenses. Cities with dignity intact, but others pushed back. Among them was a determined president, James Madison. Despite fleeing the city during the attack, he returned quickly, vowing not to let the humiliation stand. He was joined by his wife, Dolly, who became a symbol of grace under fire for her rescue of national treasures. Together, they insisted that the city would rise again. Rebuilding was slow. Funds were tight. Morale was worse. Congress convened in temporary quarters, first to the Patent Office, then later in a makeshift brick building known as the Old Brick Capitol. Every session reminded lawmakers of what had been lost. But the burning of Washington had sparked something unexpected. Result: ordinary citizens, craftsmen, and laborers joined in efforts to restore the city. Brick by brick, the Capitol rose again. Architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe returned to oversee the restoration. His designs included improvements, stronger materials, and grander visions. The president's mansion, too, was rebuilt, eventually being whitewashed to hide the burn marks. That's how it earned its now famous nickname, the White House. Rather than being abandoned, Washington became a symbol of American tenacity, a reminder that even in the face of utter humiliation, a republic could endure and rebuild. And while scars remained both visible and emotional, they hardened into resolve. Washington wasn't going anywhere because the true capital of a nation isn't just in buildings, it's in belief. The burning of Washington wasn't just a blow to architecture, it was a blow to the national ego. Up until that moment, many Americans had viewed the War of 1812 as a misguided sideshow, a political miscalculation wrapped in patriotic noise. But when British troops torched the heart of the Republic, the country snapped awake. Panic gripped citizens up and down the East Coast. If the capital could fall so easily, what city was safe? Baltimore, Philadelphia, even New York? Suddenly, the war felt very real, very close, and very dangerous. Public opinion, once divided, began to harden. The old Federalist arguments that the war was unnecessary and poorly managed began to seem almost treasonous. Even critics of President Madison now had to admit that the time for squabbling was over. The country had been slapped across the face, and it needed to respond. Militias were called up. Local defenses were reinforced. Baltimore, in particular, braced for what many assumed would be the next British target. Citizens dug trenches, built fortifications, and readied their harbor guns. The British had lit a fire not just in the buildings of Washington, but in the hearts of Americans. But it wasn't just fear that spread. It was defiance. Newspapers printed fiery editorials calling for revenge. Preachers thundered from pulpits about divine justice. Artists created stirring images of Dolly Madison and burning buildings, turning catastrophe into a kind of folk heroism. Out of the ashes, a story began to form, not of defeat, but of resilience. It was a strange transformation. The loss of the capital could have crushed morale, but instead it ignited a nationwide sense of unity. There was shame, yes, but also a desire to prove that the United States was not just a flimsy experiment in democracy, that it could take a punch and still stand. President Madison, once a cautious and often unpopular leader, began to grow in stature. He had stood by his ruined capital, vowing to rebuild, and that image of a battered but resolute republic resonated deeply. The British had hoped to humiliate. Instead, they galvanized. The war wasn't over, but America had finally begun fighting it, not just with muskets, but with meaning. If Washington was a slap, Baltimore was the punchback. Just weeks after burning the capital, British forces set their sights on Baltimore, a major port city and home to privateers who had been harassing British shipping. Confident after their success in Washington, the British assumed Baltimore would fall just as easily. They were wrong. By the time the Redcoats approached in mid-September 1814, Baltimore was ready. Local citizens, laborers, and even enslaved people had worked day and night to fortify the city. More than 10,000 volunteers dug trenches, built earthen walls, and armed Fort McHenry with heavy cannons. This wasn't going to be another walkover. The British strategy was a classic two-pronged assault, a land attack from the east and a naval bombardment from the Patapsco River. But from the beginning, things went sideways. General Robert Ross, the same man who had marched triumphantly into Washington, was killed early in a land battle by American sharpshooters. His death dealt a blow to British morale and left their command structure scrambling. Meanwhile, at sea, the British fleet began a 25-hour bombardment of Fort McHenry. Rockets streaked across the sky. Bombs exploded over the fort all night long, but the defenders held firm. They refused to surrender, even as the fort trembled under fire. And then came the morning of September 14th. As the smoke cleared and silence returned to the harbor, the British expected to see a white flag. Instead, they saw something else, a massive American flag flying defiantly over the fort's ramparts. That flag, stitched by Mary Pickersgill, was 30 feet tall, waving in the morning breeze like a middle finger to the Empire on a British ship watching all of this. It was an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key. He had come to negotiate a prisoner release, but what he saw that night inspired him to scribble down a poem. Its opening line, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?" The British realized Baltimore would not fall. They withdrew, humiliated. This time it was American resilience on display, not in speeches, but in grit, trenches, and a stubborn refusal to yield. Baltimore had survived, and in doing so it reignited belief in the American cause. A burned capital had sparked the fight, but a bombarded fort lit the flame of identity. After Baltimore, everything changed. The United States had gone from being embarrassed on the world stage to suddenly holding its ground, the British. Expecting a quick end to the war with a decisive blow in Washington, now faced growing resistance and fewer wins. Their war machine was slowing. Logistically stretched and politically pressured, they began to rethink the costs of dragging the conflict on. Baltimore's defense wasn't just a military win, it was a psychological one. It gave American negotiators something to stand on. And in the quiet city of Ghent, in what's now Belgium, talks between British and American diplomats entered a new phase. At first, British demands were steep. They wanted a Native American buffer state in the Midwest, control over parts of the Great Lakes, and even certain territorial concessions. But American diplomats, especially John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, refused to bend. They argued from a position of resilience, not desperation. And then the British started to blink. The war in Europe had drained them. Post-Napoleonic Britain had its own domestic unrest to manage. Trade disruptions were hurting both economies. The American refusal to surrender after Washington and their successful defense of Baltimore had shifted perception. This war, it turned out, couldn't be won with fire alone. By December 24, 1814, both sides reached an agreement, the Treaty of Ghent. It essentially declared a draw. No land changed hands. No reparations were paid. Impressment, one of the key reasons the U.S. had gone to war, wasn't even addressed. But neither side wanted to admit defeat, so they agreed to return to the status quo ante bellum, things as they had been before the war. And in a strange twist of history, one of the most decisive American victories, the Battle of New Orleans, happened 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Thanks to the slowness of 19th century communication, but that win sealed the emotional victory Americans needed. The war ended not with a dramatic surrender, but with a mutual shrug. Still, for the United States, it felt like something more. They had survived the burning of their capital, rallied at Baltimore, and walked away with their sovereignty and pride intact. And just like that, the Second War of Independence, as some would call it, came to a close. The embers of Washington were still warm, But from those ashes, a new kind of American identity was beginning to form. The burning of Washington was more than a war tactic. It became a defining national trauma. Yet in the strange way history often works, that moment of utter disgrace gave birth to something quietly powerful identity in the immediate aftermath. Americans had every reason to feel defeated. Their capital was reduced to smoldering rubble. Their president had fled. Their army had collapsed in battle. But the story didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. Out of that destruction came collective refusal to be defined by loss. The reconstruction of Washington wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about defiance, memory, and renewal. The new Capitol and White House will become architectural symbols of national endurance. The very act of rebuilding was a political message to the world. We're still here. And it worked. The war may have ended in a stalemate on paper, but in the American imagination, it became something else entirely. The idea that a young, disorganized republic would take on the world's greatest empire, get burned, battered, but never broken, began to solidify a sense of exceptionalism. The War of 1812, and particularly the burning of its capital, marked a kind of coming-of-age moment for the United States. It also forced change. The government took defense more seriously. Fortifications were improved along the coasts. The military, long neglected since the Revolution, began receiving better funding and more strategic organization. Civilians, too, saw themselves differently. Not as scattered citizens of states, but as participants in a shared national experiment. Culturally, the flames left a mark. Francis Scott Key's poem, inspired by the defense of Baltimore, would become the national anthem more than a century later. The term White House, born from the post-fire renovation, became permanent. Dolly Madison's bravery became a legend. And the city that once seemed like a failed compromise became the unquestioned heart of the nation. Even the British, in time, came to treat the event with a sort of embarrassed quiet. They had succeeded militarily, but arguably failed diplomatically. Their fire may have burned the walls, but not the will. In the end, the burning of Washington wasn't just a low point. It was the spark that tested and proved the durability of a republic still learning how to stand. And that fire, once meant to humiliate, helped forge the American spirit in flame. In medieval Europe, the journey into motherhood often began before a girl had fully left childhood. A girl's value, status, and even salvation were often wrapped up in her ability to bear children, especially sons. While today we might think of motherhood as a personal choice or biological event, in the Middle Ages it was a societal obligation. Women weren't just expected to become mothers. They were destined for it. Marriage was the first step. Among peasants, it might be arranged by families eager to merge land, labor, or livestock. Among the nobility, marriage was a political chess move. A noble girl might be married off by age 12 or 13, sometimes even younger in betrothal, her body pledged to a future alliance. Fertility wasn't just a blessing, it was a bargaining chip. Once married, the pressure to conceive began immediately. A wife who failed to become pregnant after a year or two was whispered about, suspected, pitted, sometimes even accused of moral or spiritual failing. If a noblewoman failed to produce an heir, her husband might seek annulment or worse. Take a mistress who is more capable. Among the nobility, a woman's womb was a national asset. Kingdoms rose or fell based on whether a queen could produce a healthy male heir. Pregnancy was met not just with celebration, but anxiety. The stakes were high. A male child might mean the continuation of a dynasty. A daughter, not useless, but certainly not ideal. Peasant women, meanwhile, had less dynastic pressure, but not less expectation. Children meant laborers. A growing family could support the farm, tend livestock, and maybe, just maybe, help the parents in old age. But with high infant mortality and no understanding of maternal health, every pregnancy was a gamble. Motherhood wasn't considered a choice. It was an expectation, a calling, even a form of penance. The church taught that Eve's sin condemned women to the pain of childbirth, and so motherhood became both duty and punishment. Women were praised for suffering in silence, for embracing their role without complaint. In the medieval mindset, a woman who didn't bear children was curiosity at best, failure at worst. The womb wasn't private. It was public property, divine machinery, and dynastic infrastructure all in one. And for most women, it would define not just their lives, but their deaths. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a battlefield, and the woman giving birth was often the lone soldier. There were no doctors in white coats, no sterile instruments, and certainly no painkillers. Instead, there were dimly lit rooms, wooden stools, herbal tinctures, whispered prayers, and an ever-present fear that this birth might be her last. Labor usually took place at home, rich or poor. Most women gave birth surrounded by other women, midwives, female relatives, and neighbors. Men were rarely present. In fact, childbirth was considered a deeply female domain, both sacred and dangerous. A midwife might have some knowledge passed down through generations, but she had no formal training. And if something went wrong, if the baby was breached, if labor stalled, if there was hemorrhaging, there was little anyone could do. Pain was expected. In fact, it was theologically required. The church taught that Eve's original sin had cursed women to suffer in childbirth, so enduring that pain was often seen as spiritually virtuous. Crying out too loudly might be interpreted as weakness, or worse, sin. Some tried to ease the suffering. Herbal concoctions made from poppy, mandrake, or henbane might dull the edge of the agony, but they were unreliable and sometimes dangerous. More often, women relied on saints, charms, and ritual. The girdle of St. Margaret was a popular talisman, wrapped around a laboring woman's belly to protect her and the child. Holy relics were placed under beds. Psalms were chanted. Midwives crossed themselves before cutting the umbilical cord, and yet death hovered. Maternal mortality was tragically common. Women could die from blood loss, infection, or retain placenta days after giving birth. Some survived the labor only to succumb to puerperal fever later. What we now know was often caused by unwashed hands or dirty linens. It's estimated that 1 in 10 births ended with the death of the mother. For poor women with multiple pregnancies, the odds only worsened. Stillbirths, too, were frequent. Babies born too early, too small, or too still. And when a child died unbaptized, it raised terrifying questions about their soul. In this world, childbirth wasn't just biology. It was peril, prayer, and penance. And every new life came at the edge of death's door. Bringing a child into the world was only the beginning. The real struggle for both mother and child was survival. In the Middle Ages, the odds were merciless. Nearly half of all children died before reaching the age of 5. Some never took their first breath. Others succumbed to illness before they could even walk. A child's first year was the most dangerous. Fevers, infections, and malnutrition were ruthless killers, and medical understanding was virtually non-existent. Peasant mothers bore the brunt of this reality. Living in cramped homes with dirt floors, surrounded by animals and drinking water from contaminated wells, they fought a daily war against disease. Diarrhea, respiratory infections, and tetanus were common causes of death. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, and certainly no hospitals. Even a mild fever could spiral into tragedy. Noble women had cleaner surroundings and better access to food, but they were not immune. Disease didn't care about titles. Plague, smallpox, measles. They took royal and commoner alike. In fact, high birth rates among the nobility weren't just about producing heirs. They were about statistical survival. Having one son wasn't enough. You needed backups. This brutal reality shaped how mothers viewed their children, especially in the early years. It wasn't uncommon for parents to delay naming a child until they passed infancy. Some mothers resisted forming strong attachments right away, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. Grief was a familiar visitor. To bury one child was a tragedy. To bury several was routine. Yet love still existed. Fierce, aching, desperate love. We see it in letters, in wills, in prayers, scrawled in the margins of manuscripts. We see it in the way mothers would walk miles to find healing herbs or bring a priest for a deathbed baptism. They didn't just mourn their children. They fought for them with everything they had. The emotional toll was enormous. There were no therapists, no morning leave, no grief counselors. A mother might lose a baby on Monday and return to her chores on Tuesday. The fields needed plowing. The fire needed stoking. Life moved forward, whether your heart was ready or not. In medieval motherhood, hope and heartbreak lived side by side. Every birth was a miracle, every survival a small defiance against the crushing odds. For noble women, motherhood wasn't just personal, it was political. A noble woman's womb was an asset of the crown, a vessel for alliances, dynasties, and succession plans. Her pregnancies were tracked with more intensity than most medieval wars, and every child, especially a son, was a strategic victory or a public failure. The pressure was immense. From the moment of marriage, a noblewoman's sole duty was to produce heirs, not just any children, legitimate, healthy male children. A queen who failed to do so risked being cast aside. Kings might seek annulments, mistresses, or even new wives altogether. Just ask Anne of Bohemia or Catherine of Aragon. A barren noblewoman wasn't just pitted. She was politically useless. Even when children were born, the mother's work wasn't done. Her role became one of anxious oversight. She didn't necessarily raise the children herself. Wet nurses, governesses, and tutors were typically responsible for daily care, but she was expected to manage their education, secure their futures, and guard their reputations like a hawk. Mothers of future kings often endured endless court gossip, factional intrigue, and manipulation. Their sons were pawns before they could walk, betrothed before they could speak, and daughters. They were marriage chips, often sent to foreign courts as teenagers, sometimes never to return. Still, noble mothers weren't always distant or decorative. Some wielded enormous influence through their children. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just birth kings. She advised them, corrected them, and in one case rebelled against them. Margaret of Anjou led armies to defend her son's throne. Isabella of France orchestrated the deposition of her husband in her son's name. These were not passive mothers. These were political operatives disguised in velvet and lace. Motherhood also came with heartbreak. Stillbirths, disease, assassinations, and exile. Royal children were far from safe. The higher the rank, the deadlier the game. Emotionally, noble mothers lived in constant tension. They had status, but not always agency. Love for their children was real, but often tangled with duty. They were expected to sacrifice their bodies, their privacy, and even their maternal instincts for the good of their house. If noble women bore the weight of dynasties, peasant mothers carried the full burden of survival, raw, relentless, and unromantic. For the medieval peasant woman, motherhood wasn't a stage of life. It was life itself. It began young, ended late, and rarely offered rest in between. These women typically married in their mid-teens and were pregnant almost constantly through their 20s and 30s. With no access to reliable birth control, and with the church staunchly condemning any form of contraception, pregnancy was a near constant state. Each child born was another mouth to feed, but also potentially another pair of hands to work the land. Peasant women gave birth at home. No doctors, no clean linens, and no privacy. A neighbor midwife might assist or not. Some women gave birth alone in barns or fields, returned to laboring within hours, and hoped not to bleed out under the sky. Death during or after childbirth wasn't uncommon, and no one issued apologies for it. Life was cruel, fast, and unsentimental. Child rearing began the moment the umbilical cord was cut. There was no such thing as maternity leave. Infants were swaddled tightly and either carried on the mother's body while she worked or left in cradles near hearth fires, supervised by older siblings or none at all. Crying wasn't coddled. It was a sound absorbed into the rhythm of daily toil. Mothers taught their children by example, how to feed chickens, gather firewood, weed gardens, and patch clothes. Even toddlers were expected to fetch water or carry messages. Every child needed to contribute. Childhood as we think of it, innocent, protected, full of toys and schooling, simply didn't exist. And yet, despite the hardship, there was affection. Mothers sang lullabies, braided their daughters' hair, whispered prayers as they tucked children beside them on shared straw beds. Love was expressed through food, through warmth, through sacrifice. A mother giving her portion of bread to a hungry child. A mother walking barefoot so her son could wear her only pair of shoes to church. Peasant motherhood was a master class in endurance. These women carried not just babies, but burdens, firewood, expectations, and loss. Their backs bent with the weight of a world that never paused, even when they buried a child. And still they kept going in the medieval world. Feeding a baby was a matter of both biology and hierarchy. For most mothers, especially peasants, breastfeeding was non-negotiable. It was natural, expected, and vital for survival. Formula didn't exist, and animal milk was risky and often contaminated. A mother's body was the only lifeline. Peasant mothers breastfed their babies for as long as possible, often well into toddlerhood, because they had to. Breastfeeding not only nourished the child, it also acted as a form of rudimentary birth control, slightly delaying the return of fertility and accidental mercy in a world of near constant pregnancies. These women worked the fields with infants strapped to their backs, pausing to feed them between planting and harvesting. But in noble households, the rules changed. For upper-class women, breastfeeding was often considered beneath their station, physically draining, emotionally inconvenient, and culturally unfitting for a lady of refinement. Enter the wet nurse. These were lower-class women selected for their health and milk supply, who were paid to breastfeed noble infants full-time. They often lived with the child and formed deep maternal bonds, sometimes stronger than the one between mother and child. The church had mixed feelings about this. Some theologians worried that a child nursed by a morally impure woman might absorb her sins. Others believed wet nurses were a practical necessity for women who needed to remain fertile and continue producing heirs. After all, a queen could not risk wasting time nursing one child when she needed to be pregnant with the next. Infant care itself was harsh by modern standards. Swaddling was nearly universal. Babies were wrapped tightly in cloth to straighten their limbs and train them not to move too much. Diapers existed, or often reused rags or moss-lined cloth changed infrequently. Baths were rare. Teething was treated with charms or folk remedies. Cribs were hard, if they existed at all. Babies often shared a bed with their parents, increasing the risk of accidental smothering. Sickness struck quickly. Remedies ranged from herbal infusions to prayers to saints, and if a child died, especially in infancy, some believed it was God's will, or worse, punishment for the mother's sins. Still, mothers did what they could. They rocked, soothed, fed, and sang lullabies in languages long lost. Love found its way, even in the mud and shadows of medieval life. In medieval Europe, motherhood wasn't just physical labor, it was spiritual labor too. The church had a firm grip on the experience of pregnancy, birth and parenting. Everything from conception to burial was soaked in religious meaning, and a mother's soul was always under scrutiny. Before childbirth, women often turned to saints for protection. Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially popular among expectant mothers. Legend claimed she could protect them during labor because she herself had once emerged unscathed from the belly of a dragon. Her prayers were recited, her image worn on tokens, her name whispered during contractions. Childbirth, in the eyes of the church, was tainted by sin. Thanks to the story of Eve, women were told that pain in labor was punishment for humanity's original fall. So even in the most joyful moment, the birth of a child, a mother was reminded of her innate guilt. And if she died in childbirth without confession, she risked spiritual peril. Once the baby was born, baptism became the next urgent step. The fear of limbo was real. If a child died before being baptized, many believed their soul would be denied heaven. Midwives were sometimes authorized to perform emergency baptisms if a baby was too sick to wait for a priest. The idea of eternal damnation for a newborn was horrifying, but not uncommon in medieval theology. Superstition filled in where doctrine left gaps. Mothers tied charms to cradles, hung herds above doorways, or drew protective symbols in ashes on the floor. The evil eye, malevolent fairies, and demonic spirits were all blamed for sickly babies or miscarriages. Some mothers whispered secret names for their children to confuse spirits who might come to steal them away. The church also had control over how women were reintegrated into society after birth, the churching ceremony. usually held about 40 days after delivery, was a kind of ritual purification. Until then, a mother was considered spiritually unclean and was expected to stay out of public worship. The ceremony was meant to bless and welcome her back, but it was also a subtle rebuke. Childbirth, though necessary, left a stain. Despite the harsh theology, many mothers found comfort in faith. Prayer was protection. Ritual was reassurance. And hope lived somewhere between the Psalms and the pain. Once a child survived infancy, the next phase of medieval motherhood began, shaping a human who could survive in a brutal world. And this meant discipline, hard truths, and often early separation. For peasant mothers, education wasn't about books, it was about survival skills. From the moment a child could walk, they were expected to contribute. Girls helped gather firewood, feed chickens, and carry water. Boys learned to tend animals, swing tools, and follow behind their fathers in the fields. Mothers were the first teachers, showing their children how to knead dough, spin wool, or patch a worn tunic. The lessons were practical, immediate, and passed down like heirlooms. Discipline was stern, but not necessarily cruel in a world where disobedience could mean death. A wandering child might drown in a well or be kicked by a horse. Strictness was a form of love. Corporal punishment was common, but so were rewards. A warm meal, a kiss on the forehead, a song by the hearth. Affection and correction often went hand in hand. Among the nobility, education took a different shape. Boys were sent off to train as pages or squires, often before they turned 10. Girls were sometimes placed in convents or noble households to learn etiquette, embroidery, and the finer points of courtly behavior. For noble mothers, this meant letting go of their children early, sometimes never to raise them at all. That didn't mean they didn't care. Letters from noble women reveal deep concern for their children's health, marriages, and reputations. A noble mother might not tuck her child in every night, but she was often behind the scenes, arranging their futures like a chess master. Still, the emotional toll of separation was real. Children might be raised by strangers, nursed by others, and married off by 15. A mother might hear of her child's death via messenger, or not at all. And yet medieval mothers found ways to stay connected through prayers, through keepsakes, through traditions. They passed down songs, names, and customs, embedding themselves in their children's lives, whether near or far. Medieval motherhood wasn't about holding on. It was about preparing to let go early, often, and without guarantee. Medieval mothers rarely left written records. They didn't pen diaries or publish books, but their fingerprints are everywhere in the lullabies that survived, the traditions passed down, the prayers carved into chapel walls, and the bones of the children they raised against all odds. Their love didn't look like ours. There were no baby showers, no ultrasound photos on the wall. Affection was quiet, practical, and often masked by the need to stay emotionally guarded. After all, when so many children died young, to love deeply was to risk devastation. And yet, mothers did love fiercely, patiently, and without pause. We find traces of that love in the margins of medieval texts, where a woman scribbled her lost child's name beside a prayer, in letters from queens begging for news of their children, in the battered shoes left on graves, in folk tales where mothers trade their lives for their children's safety. These weren't symbols of weakness. They were acts of defiance in a world constantly testing maternal strength. Loss was a constant companion. Stillbirths, fevers, plagues, war. A mother could raise 10 children and bury 6. Mourning was private, often silent, yet carried for a lifetime. Grief wasn't always spoken, but it was never absent. And still they endured. They endured childbirth with no medicine. They endured the shame of barrenness and the pain of losing child after child. They endured the church's scrutiny, society's demands, and their own bodies are limited. Some endured violence from husbands. Others endured exile, poverty, or starvation. But through it all, they nurtured, protected, taught, and most miraculously hoped. Their legacy isn't written in stone monuments, but in generations that followed. They are the unnamed ancestors who fed us, clothed us, and somehow made it all work. They built the foundations of family and survival. Even when the odds said they shouldn't have, medieval motherhood wasn't saintly, and it wasn't soft. It was tough, complicated, heartbreaking, and brave. It was sometimes joyful, often tragic, always vital. In every sense, these women were the silent architects of the medieval world, and though history rarely carved their names into its walls, their labor shaped kingdoms, their choices molded futures, and their sacrifices echo into us long after the cradles were emptied and the prayers faded. Long before we ever glimpsed the moons of Jupiter or the rings of Saturn, humanity stared up at the night sky with wonder and very limited tools. In the pre-telescopic world, the cosmos was a vast, unreachable canvas. People tracked stars, plotted planets, and marked the seasons. But they did it all with the naked eye. And that eye, remarkable as it is, has limits. For most of human history, the sky was interpreted more than it was studied. Ancient cultures turned constellations into stories. Orion was a hunter, Scorpio, a scorpion sent by the gods. The Greeks named wandering lights planets wanderers because they moved differently than fixed stars. But no one really knew what they were. Were they fiery chariots? Crystal spheres? Divine lanterns? No one had any way to look closer and find out. Observation meant standing under the stars and recording what could be seen. Tools like the astrolabe, developed by Islamic astronomers, helped track celestial motion with surprising precision. The Babylonians and Mayans kept meticulous calendars and predicted eclipses. The Greeks built complex mechanical devices like the Antikythera mechanism to calculate planetary positions. But no one could see beyond what the eye allowed, and that meant space remained more mystery than reality. The idea of magnifying vision was, at best, a curiosity. People understood reflection. Mirrors existed, but refraction, the bending of light through a lens, was still a misunderstood phenomenon. The science of optics was in its infancy, and no one had yet considered applying it to the stars. More importantly, no one imagined that the sky itself could change. The heavens were considered perfect, eternal, and unchanging. Aristotle's realm of divine order. The earth, by contrast, was corrupt and chaotic. This belief held back scientific progress for centuries. Why build a device to examine something you already believed to be flawless? And yet, the need was there, buried in the questions humanity kept asking. What are the stars made of? Why do some lights move and others don't? Is Earth truly at the center of everything? All of those questions floated unanswered above a world that had no way to peer beyond its boundaries. No one. Until glassmakers, tinkerers, and one curious Dutchman changed everything. Long before anyone dreamed of peering into the stars, ancient people were already bending light, just not intentionally. In fact, the earliest lenses were likely accidents. Transparent crystals like quartz or beryl could naturally magnify objects when shaped just right. These stones, polished and rounded by hand or nature, would occasionally reveal something curious. Objects looked larger when seen through them. To our ancestors, it must have seemed like magic. By the first millennium BCE, the Assyrians had crafted what we now call the Nimrud lens, a piece of rock crystal possibly used to magnify or focus light. Its exact purpose is debated. Was it part of a scientific tool or just decorative? Regardless, it proves one thing. Humans had started to notice that light could be manipulated. Fast forward to ancient Rome, where reading stones appeared, hemispherical pieces of glass placed directly on text to enlarge the letters beneath. They were the precursors to magnifying glasses and a direct link in the evolutionary chain of optics. These tools didn't explore the sky, but they gave humanity a hint. Sight could be enhanced. Yet the real leap came not in Rome, but in the Islamic Golden Age. In the 10th and 11th centuries, a polymath named Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Alhazen, revolutionized the study of light. He wasn't building telescopes, but his work laid down the theory of how they would one day work. Alhazen conducted experiments with glass, mirrors, and water to understand how light traveled and bent. He proposed that vision wasn't sent out from the eyes, as many believed, but rather that light entered the eyes, an insight so obvious today it's hard to believe it was once controversial. His book of optics laid out principles of refraction and reflection, defining the science of light centuries before Europe would rediscover it. Though these thinkers never applied their theories to the stars, they built the intellectual scaffolding needed for future inventors. Their writings, once translated into Latin, spread through medieval Europe, setting the stage for the explosive optical experimentation of the Renaissance. By the 13th century, the science of optics had quietly crept into everyday life, not through astronomy, but through a far more personal issue: bad eyesight. In the bustling workshops of Italy, particularly around Venice, glassmakers began crafting lenses to help aging monks and scholars read their manuscripts. The result? Spectacles. The earliest spectacles appeared around 1285, likely in Pisa or Venice. They were simple convex lenses framed in wood or metal, designed to sit precariously on the nose. There were no temples, no arms to hook behind the ears. Users simply pinched them into place or held them up by hand. But the effect was revolutionary. For the first time, people could fight back against fading vision. The popularity of reading glasses spread fast, especially among clergy and educated elites. Monks could now read scripture well into their later years. Scholars could pore over texts late into the night. Glassmakers had stumbled upon a booming industry. Even though they didn't fully understand the physics behind what they were selling, still, this new obsession with magnification planted an idea in the collective imagination. The glass could help us see the small, could also help us see the distant. The leap wasn't immediate. For centuries, spectacle making remained a trade focused on individual needs, helping people see books and thread needles, but in the background. Knowledge of convex and concave lenses slowly matured. Artisans began playing with lens shapes. Scholars copied and built upon old Arabic texts about refraction. Tinkering became more ambitious. The Renaissance, with its mania for rediscovery and reinvention, poured fuel on this fire. Experimenters began combining lenses, sometimes in play, sometimes in pursuit of genuine innovation, and eventually, someone stumbled upon a configuration that did something unexpected. It brought distant objects closer. That someone, according to most accounts, was Hans Lippershey, a Dutch spectacle maker who around 1608 assembled a device that could magnify faraway objects. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. His invention, a simple tube with two lenses, was dubbed the spyglass. It had the power to change warfare, navigation, and soon the cosmos. But Lippershey wouldn't be the one to turn it to the stars. That would take a different kind of mind, part scientist, part showman, and entirely unafraid to challenge the heavens. When news of Hans Lippershey's spyglass reached Italy, one man saw something others didn't, a way to challenge the very fabric of the cosmos. That man was Galileo Galilei, a mathematics professor from Pisa with a flair for experimentation and a deep skepticism toward accepted truths. Upon hearing of the Dutch device in 1609, he didn't just want to copy it, he wanted to improve it. Within months, he built his own telescope, first a 3x magnification, then an 8x, and soon after a 20x. Compared to Lippershey's clunky tool, Galileo's telescope was sharper, longer, and more refined. And then he pointed it at the sky. The moment was historic. Through his handmade lenses, Galileo became the first human to truly see the heavens. What he found shattered the delicate, divine perfection taught by Aristotle and defended by the Church. The moon, for instance, was not a smooth, glowing sphere. Galileo saw craters and mountains in perfection. The Milky Way wasn't a milky smear. It was made up of countless stars. Jupiter, thought to be just another wandering light, had moons, four of them orbiting the planet like tiny celestial satellites. He named them the Medicean stars after his patrons, but we know them today as the Galilean moons: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. And most shocking of all, Venus had phases just like the moon, proving it orbited the sun, not Earth. With each observation, Galileo drove a dagger into the heart of the old geocentric model. The Earth, it seemed, was not the center of everything. The universe was bigger, stranger, and more dynamic than anyone had imagined. Galileo published his findings in Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, in 1610. It was a sensation, a celestial tell-all. Crowds gathered to see his telescope. Scholars praised him. The church grew uneasy because this wasn't just a scientific tool anymore. The telescope had become dangerous. It offered evidence that contradicted centuries of theological doctrine. The heavens, once thought immutable and divine, now looked messy, changing, and full of motion. Galileo hadn't just invented astronomy. He had weaponized vision, and with a few polished lenses, he had started a war between observation and belief. The stars would never be safe or silent again. Galileo had proven what two lenses in a tube could do. But his Galilean design, one convex lens at the front, one concave at the eyepiece, had limits. A narrow field of view, blurry edges, and paltry magnification once you pushed beyond 30x. Enter Johannes Kepler, the German mathematician already famous for his laws of planetary motion. Reading The Starry Messenger in 1610, Kepler asked a simple question. Could the optics be better? Within a year, he produced Dioptrice, a treatise that rewrote the rulebook of lenses. Kepler proposed swapping Galileo's concave eyepiece for a second convex lens. The image would flip upside down, but the payoff was huge. A wider field, sharper focus, and theoretically unlimited magnification. Kepler himself never built the device. He spent his life juggling patronage, plague, and family tragedy, but his blueprint spread across Europe like contraband. Tinkerers seized on the idea. In Italy, Francesco Fontana crafted long, unwieldy instruments, some stretching 6 meters, claiming 160x power. In the Netherlands, Christian Huygens and his brother would later push the length past 30 meters to hunt for Saturn's rings. But the first verified Keplerian telescopes appeared in the 1630s, likely built by the Jesuit astronomer Christoph Scheiner. He demonstrated one to the emperor in Vienna, dazzling courtiers with right-angled spies on distant church spires, albeit all upside down. The inverted view was a small price to pay for clarity, yet it created a new market, directing eyepieces and clever mirror diagonals for land-based viewing. Artisans in Paris and London competed to sell astronomical versus terrestrial models. Telescopes were no longer scientific curiosities. They were luxury items for nobles who wanted to brag about seeing ships before they reached harbor. Meanwhile, Kepler's optics ignited serious science. With clearer images, astronomers could sketch sunspots, map lunar valleys, and time Jupiter's moons so precisely. They proposed using them as celestial clocks for longitude. The telescope was evolving from a disruptive gadget to an indispensable instrument. Yet every added inch of focal length made tubes sag and glass blur. The race was on for shorter telescopes with longer power. That challenge would summon a genius who hated chromatic smears and loved apples. One Isaac Newton. The arms race of vision was far from over. It was only changing shape. By the mid-1600s, the refracting telescope had stretched to absurd proportions. In pursuit of better magnification, astronomers were building scopes longer than houses, some over 100 feet long, just to tame a frustrating flaw. Chromatic aberration. This was the rainbow-colored smudge that bled around bright objects. As light passed through curved lenses, colors split like a prism, creating blurry halos. No matter how carefully a lens was shaped, the colors refused to behave. Enter Isaac Newton, a man who not only understood the problem, but also refused to tolerate it. Newton, already famed for calculus and gravity, turned his razor-sharp intellect to optics. His solution? Stop using lenses altogether. In 1668, Newton introduced something radical, the reflecting telescope. Instead of bending light through glass, he used a curved mirror to collect and focus it. Mirrors didn't split light into rainbows. They didn't need to be hundreds of feet long. And best of all, they could be short, powerful, and precise. Newton's design used a concave primary mirror at the bottom of the tube, which reflected light to a flat diagonal mirror, then into the eyepiece mounted on the side. It looked nothing like Galileo's spyglass, but it worked. The image was crisp, clear, and most importantly, free of color distortion. At first, Newton kept his invention quiet. He wasn't a fan of public drama, but by 1672 he presented the telescope to the Royal Society, and it caused a stir. Here was a compact instrument with better performance than refractors many times its size. Observers could now study Jupiter's belts, Saturn's rings. and the rugged lunar surface with stunning detail, and from a backyard, not a cathedral rooftop. Still, the reflecting telescope came with its own challenges. Making a perfectly parabolic mirror was difficult early. Versions used polished metal, which tarnished quickly and had to be repolished constantly. But the core idea was revolutionary, and its potential undeniable. Newton's invention didn't replace refractors overnight, but it cracked the telescope wide open. Astronomers now had two competing paths: lenses or mirrors. And as mirror technology improved, Newton's quiet rebellion would reshape the very architecture of astronomy. The universe hadn't changed, but the way we saw it just took a leap forward. By the 18th century, telescopes had escaped the hands of individual tinkerers and entered the age of national pride, royal funding, and scientific ambition. The telescope was no longer just a clever invention. It was now a weapon in the battle to understand the universe, and across Europe, astronomers were wielding it like never before. One name towers above this era: William Herschel, a German-born musician turned self-taught astronomer. Herschel moved to England and became obsessed with the night sky. With the help of his brilliant sister Caroline Herschel, he began building massive reflecting telescopes in his backyard, melting metal, casting mirrors, grinding lenses by hand. One of his designs reached over 40 feet long with a 4-foot wide mirror. It was the largest telescope in the world at the time, and with it he made history. In 1781, Herschel discovered Uranus, the first new planet found since ancient times. It shook the foundations of astronomy. Suddenly, the solar system was bigger than anyone had imagined. Herschel didn't stop there. He charted thousands of stars, cataloged nebulae, and coined the term galaxy. He speculated that some of the fuzzy clouds seen through his telescope might be entire island universes far beyond our own. Caroline, meanwhile, became a respected astronomer in her own right. She discovered several comets, refined star charts, and published groundbreaking catalogs, working tirelessly beside her brother in the observatory. Elsewhere, the telescope was also helping scientists crack long-standing puzzles. Astronomers used it to track transits of Venus, calculating the Earth's distance from the Sun. Telescopic measurements improved celestial navigation, allowing ships to traverse oceans with far greater precision. Naval empires quite literally depended on the sky. And while Newton's reflectors remain elite instruments, achromatic refractors, which reduced chromatic aberration using special lens combinations, were now commercially available. Opticians like John Doolan refined lenses to sharpen the image without the rainbow smears, offering the best of both worlds, clarity and color correction. Observatories were being built across Europe: Paris, Berlin, Greenwich. Astronomy became institutionalized. Telescopes sat not just in scholars' attics, but in towers, domes, and royal estates. They had become symbols of enlightenment and empire. This was the golden age of stargazing, when a telescope wasn't just expanding our view, but our very place in the cosmos. As the 19th century dawned, the telescope entered its industrial phase. What began as handmade tubes of brass and glass now became precision-engineered instruments of steel, bronze, and cast iron. The sky, once mapped by candlelight, was now being charted by the rising might of factories, railroads, and empire. The biggest shift? Telescopes were getting enormous. In Ireland, a wealthy astronomer named William Parsons, the third Earl of Ross, constructed what was then the largest telescope on Earth. Completed in 1845, the Leviathan of Parsons Town boasted a mere 6 feet in diameter and a tube 50 feet long, suspended between two massive masonry walls. It looked more like a siege weapon than a scientific instrument, but it worked. With it, Parsons observed the swirling structure of what was then called the Whirlpool Nebula, now known as M51, and made one of the first sketches resembling a spiral galaxy. He had no way of knowing how far away it truly was, but the drawing alone hinted that the universe might be full of systems like our own, far beyond the Milky Way. Meanwhile, other observatories sprang up in France, Russia, and America. Astronomers were no longer lone geniuses in cloaks, but salaried researchers with assistants, budgets, and government grants. Telescopes began moving westward toward drier air, clearer skies, and higher altitudes. One of the most famous was the Lick Observatory in California, built atop Mount Hamilton in 1888. It housed the largest refracting telescope ever constructed, with a 36-inch objective lens. Not to be outdone, the Yerkes Observatory in Wisconsin followed in 1897 with an even longer refractor, still the biggest of its kind to this day. But refractors were nearing their limit. Lenses sagged under their own weight. Glass this big couldn't be perfectly cast or supported. The future once again pointed to mirrors. Engineers began experimenting with silver-coated glass, lighter and easier to maintain than Newton's old metal mirrors. Reflectors, once overshadowed by their lens-based cousins, were making a comeback. At the same time, photography entered the equation. For the first time, telescopes weren't just for viewing the heavens, they could record them. Astronomers began capturing long-exposure images of stars, nebulae, and planets. Seeing deeper than ever before, the age of observation was ending. The age of data had begun. As the 20th century unfolded, the telescope transformed from a tool of vision into a machine of revelation. No longer limited to what the eye could see, telescopes began collecting data across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, unlocking secrets the visible light had always hidden from us. The revolution began atop Mount Wilson in California, where George Ellery Hale spearheaded the creation of the Hooker telescope, completed in 1917. With a 100-inch mirror, it was the most powerful telescope of its time. And into that mirror stared a young astronomer named Edwin Hubble. In the 1920s, Hubble used the Hooker to peer into the Andromeda Nebula. What he discovered changed everything. Andromeda wasn't a cloud within our galaxy. It was a galaxy itself, one of millions. Hubble's work demolished the idea of a small, static universe. The cosmos, it turned out, was vast, expanding, and ancient beyond measure. Soon, even the atmosphere became a limitation. Earth's air blurred starlight and blocked much of the electromagnetic spectrum. So in the latter half of the century, telescopes began climbing higher into balloons, planes, and eventually orbit in 1990. NASA launched the Hubble Space Telescope, a namesake tribute orbiting above Earth's distortive atmosphere. After an initial hiccup with its mirror, Hubble went on to deliver the most detailed images of the universe ever captured. Pillars of gas, dying stars, infant galaxies. It stared deeper into time than any human eye ever had, and Hubble was just the beginning. Radio telescopes like those at Arecibo and the Very Large Array in New Mexico allowed scientists to listen to space. Infrared telescopes revealed cool, hidden objects cloaked in cosmic dust. X-ray telescopes detected black holes devouring matter. Each new type of telescope revealed a new layer of the cosmos. Then came the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, far more sensitive than Hubble, designed to look back over 13 billion years to the dawn of galaxy formation. Not just an eye in the sky, but a time machine built of gold mirrors and deep mathematics. From Galileo's shaky wooden tube to spacefaring observatories cooled by liquid helium, the telescope has evolved into an instrument of pure awe. We no longer just see the universe, we decode it. And with each new lens, mirror, or frequency unlocked, we inch closer to answering the question that started it all. What else is out there? You awaken to the sound of something between a horn and a man screaming the word march like it owes him money. There is no snooze button. There is no mattress. There is only the damp, cold earth and the deep spiritual ache of having slept in your armor. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it. Your chainmail has become one with your body like a clingy ex. Around you, a dozen other soldiers are waking up, each with the same look of regret and trenched foot. One guy is still asleep with his head on a helmet full of rainwater. Another is trying to pull a slug out of his boot with a dagger. You're not sure if you should eat breakfast or apologize to your organs in advance. Breakfast, by the way, is what we call historically significant disappointment. It's a crust of bread so hard it could deflect arrows, possibly made last Lent. You chew slowly, not because you're savoring it, but because your jaw is still sore from yesterday's feast, which included meat of questionable origin and something that may have once been a vegetable. You wash it down with warm ale, because medieval water was a game of bacterial roulette. There's no time for grooming. Not that it matters. You haven't seen your own face in weeks, and frankly, that's for the best. You splash a handful of swamp water on your cheeks for the illusion of hygiene, then strap on gear that smells like it's been fermenting in fear. Then came to orders. Form up, move out. Yelled by someone on a horse who clearly hasn't walked a mile in his life. The army stirs, men grumble, armor clanks, and someone is already limping from stepping on a pointy rock while barefoot. The mud sucks at your boots like it's trying to claim your soul. You haven't even made contact with the enemy yet, and you're already exhausted, damp, hungry, and vaguely regretting your entire life. And you know what the worst part is? This is one of the good mornings. The command is given march, and so you do. Not because you want to, but because the alternative is staying behind and getting accused of desertion, which usually ends with something being chopped off. So you trudge forward, one squelching, miserable footstep at a time. The ground is less earth and more moist to despair. Mud is a given, but this is no ordinary mud. It's the kind that sucks at your boots like it's trying to steal your soul, or at least your left foot. You stop to adjust a strap and instantly fall behind, drawing glares from the man behind you, whose face says, "I will eat you if this slows me down again." Armor, it turns out, was not designed for hiking. It creaks, it pinches, and it rubs in places you didn't even know had skin. Your shoulders ache, your thighs burn, and your inner thighs are forming an alliance against you with every clanking step. You are essentially a walking iron sausage being slow, roasted in your own sweat. The air smells like livestock, cheap onions and fear. Someone ahead passes gas with the kind of force that suggests they lost a battle with last night's turnip stew. You try to breathe through your mouth, but immediately regret that decision too. You pass a dead hedgehog, a broken cart, and what might be a toe. No one stops. Stopping is for people who enjoy being yelled at. The sergeant yells anyway. He doesn't stop yelling. It's his entire personality now. Morale is non-existent. Some men sing war songs to cope, others mutter prayers. One guy in the back just screams into the wind. No one stops him. Honestly, it helps. At one point, you think maybe the enemy will surrender before we get there. Then you remember they're probably thinking the same thing, which means this is going to end with someone panicking, everyone stabbing. And you're trying to remember which end of the spear goes where. After hours, a hill appears. Of course it does. Every medieval battle takes place at the top of a stupid hill. As you begin the ascent, someone slips and rolls down. No one helps. They're better off now. And still you march. Eventually you arrive at the place where you'll not sleep tonight. The battle camp. It's less base of operations and more organized. There are tents, sure, if you're nobility. The rest of you get a patch of mud slightly less cursed than the rest. You stake your spot by collapsing on the ground and calling it a bed. Your neighbor does the same. Congratulations, you've started a trench community. The smell hits you next. A horrifying cocktail of wet wool, unwashed bodies, fermented boots, and whatever is rotting near the food cart. There's a buzz in the air. Not excitement, just flies. Thousands of them. Some of them have names now. You made peace with that. Then there's the latrine. And by latrine, we mean a shallow hole in the ground that was dug in haste and regret. Privacy. None. Smell. Biblical. You try not to look anyone in the eyes during your visit. Everyone's dignity has already fled. You're handed a bowl of stew. It's gray. That's the only flavor. Gray. You ask what's in it, and the cook makes eye contact for 5 uncomfortable seconds before walking away. You eat it anyway because you're starving, and you hope whatever meat is in there didn't have a name 2 hours ago. Some men are sharpening weapons, others are playing dice. A few are praying very loudly, not out of devotion, but to make sure everyone sees that they're praying, just in case God's offering extra protection to the dramatic ones. Then there's the sounds. Hacking coughs, distant weeping, a man singing off-key about bread, and somewhere, someone trying to play a lute like it's a weapon. You hear a night bark an order. He's clean. He smells like lavender. You hate him instantly. Night falls. You curl up in your damp cloak, lying next to a guy who snores like he swallowed a donkey. You try to sleep, but your brain's too busy imagining all the ways you could die tomorrow or tonight if that goat kicks you in your ribs again. And as you finally start to doze, a voice yells from the distance, "Form up at sunrise." Fantastic. Another beautiful morning awaits. Dawn breaks, and with it comes the icy realization that you're going to die in a field. Probably soon, possibly before lunch. You haven't even brushed your teeth. Not that you have a toothbrush or any teeth worth saving. Trumpets sound. Men groan. You crawl out of your damp cocoon of lice-infested wool to find your comrades already pretending to be motivated. You line up because standing in rows makes people feel slightly more in control than you do. It's a lie, but it's one you can shuffle into with numb feet and questionable bowel control. And then he appears, the noble commander. A man wearing polished armor so clean it's practically glowing. He's got that energy only people who've never been punched in the face tend to have. He surveys the troops like a disappointed parent who just found out you joined the losing side in a tavern brawl. He clears his throat. Everyone braces. It begins. Men, today we fight for glory. Pause for effect. Someone near you coughs up something alive. For our king, our lands, our honor. The crowd murmurs, mostly from stomach cramps, not patriotism. Look to your brothers. Look at your steel. You glance sideways. The man next to you is visibly shaking and has his helmet on backward. His steel is bent. The enemy fears us. They probably don't. They probably have their own guy yelling the same thing in another accent. If you die today, oh, good, the cheerful bit. You die as heroes. You suppress the urge to raise your hand and ask, "Can I die later? Maybe as a baker?" Then comes the bit about God. God is on your side, which is reassuring, except you're fairly sure God's been busy smiting everyone equally this season. The speech ends with a sword thrust to the sky and a mighty shout of forward. No one moves. A few guys blink. One guy sneezes. The shouting continues until someone finally shuffles forward and the rest reluctantly follow. Not out of conviction, mind you. Mostly because standing still means the commander might single you out for a volunteer job. And you've heard what happened to the last volunteer. Thus ends the pep talk. You are now spiritually prepared to panic with a purpose. So now it's time to form ranks, a noble phrase conjuring images of precision, discipline, and strategy. What you actually get is a very confused clump of people vaguely facing the same direction, half of whom are still trying to put on their helmets. Some are holding weapons they just picked up 5 minutes ago. One guy is gripping a pitchfork. You're pretty sure he's just here by accident. Your sergeant, who was probably a pig farmer 3 years ago, starts barking numbers. No one knows what they mean, but everyone nods as if they understand. "Front line, shield wall," he screams. The second line pikes forward. You do as instructed, even though the guy in front of you has his shield upside down and is using it to itch his back. To your left is a guy with a spear twice his height who keeps poking people unintentionally. To your right is a man humming a battle hymn that may or may not just be Greensleeves with different lyrics. Directly behind you is someone breathing like he's been practicing dramatic dying noises in advance. You suspect he might not even be wounded, just ready. The cavalry is off to one side, horses pouring the ground dramatically, knights sitting tall and pristine in full plate armor that cost more than your entire village. They look majestic. You, meanwhile, are standing in borrowed boots and chainmail that smells like someone died in it, probably because someone did. There's a sudden order to move forward and tighten the line. This is easier said than done when every second man is stepping on someone else's foot and the mud is threatening to swallow small soldiers whole. Your feet slide. Someone elbows you. Your shield is backwards now, and you don't have the emotional energy to fix it. Then comes the drumbeat, a slow, ominous thud that tells everyone it's about to start. Men start whispering prayers. One man starts quietly sobbing. You pretend not to notice, mostly because you're busy making your own peace with mortality. You take a deep breath, raise your weapon, and try not to pass out. This is it. You're ready. Well, as ready as anyone in a crooked line of terrified peasants can be. Just when the formation starts looking somewhat believable, meaning no one is actively walking in the wrong direction, the sky betrays you. It begins with a sound, a soft, distant whoosh that becomes a collective whisper of doom. Then the shouting starts. Shields up. You scramble to obey, though someone nearby is still trying to figure out which end of the shield is up. A moment later, the sky darkens, not with clouds, but with hundreds of tiny death sticks launched from the enemy's side with alarming enthusiasm. And then they fall. The arrows rain down with all the mercy of an angry god having a very bad day. The man 2 rows ahead of you drops instantly, an arrow sticking out of his shoulder like a forgotten quill. Someone screams. Someone else curses in Latin. Or maybe he was just sneezing. It's hard to tell through the panic. Here's what the movies don't show. Arrows don't glide gracefully into targets like ballerinas with sharp toes. They thud, crack, stick, and occasionally bounce off armor before embedding themselves in things not meant to be pierced, like feet, thighs, and whatever counts as emotional stability. You try to shrink behind your shield, which suddenly feels far too small and alarmingly homemade. An arrow clatters off it with a metallic clang, and you immediately decide that this shield is now your best friend. You mentally name it Gerald. You whisper promises to Gerald that if you survive, you'll never talk badly about its lopsided shape again. To your left, someone is cursing the archers. To your right, someone is being cursed, mostly because he forgot to duck. Behind you, a man is yelling that he's hit, though you strongly suspect he's just trying to get out of what's coming next. Then the second volley comes. At this point, any illusion of calm has evaporated. Veterans crouch low and mumble mantras. New recruits cry openly. One guy just lies down and pretends to be dead. Not a terrible strategy, honestly. Eventually, the sky clears. You're alive. Gerald did good. But now the real horror begins. Close combat, which means it's time to get very sweaty, very loud, and probably stabbed. There's no countdown, no dramatic drum roll. No theatrical charge like in the songs. One moment you're trembling in your half-formed line, and the next all hell breaks loose. It starts with a surge. Your side moves forward. Not so much with courage as with a reluctant momentum of men who know they'll be trampled if they hesitate. Someone ahead of you yells something inspiring, promptly trips and gets stepped on. You don't stop to help. Not because you're cruel, but because you're fairly certain you'll join him if you do. And then you hit literally. There's a collision. You slam into another human being like a sack of potatoes, colliding with a sack of potatoes, wearing sharp objects. Forget fancy swordplay. This is not a dance. This is a meat blender. You swing your weapon. Maybe a sword, maybe an axe, maybe just a glorified kitchen tool. You don't aim. You don't have time. You flail. You hear metal crash against metal, would shatter, men grunt, and someone nearby repeatedly yelling like it's a war chant. The fighting is close. Intimate, really. You are now deeply aware of the smell of the enemy. Sweat, fear, and onions. There is no such thing as personal space. There is only panic. At one point you stab downward and hope it wasn't your own foot. Your helmet fogs up. You can't see. You can't breathe. Someone's shoulder slams into your ribs, and you both stumble sideways, gasping. There's blood on your gauntlet. Not yours, probably. Could be. Doesn't matter. A man swings at your head. You duck out of reflex. He hits someone else. You exchange a brief glance. Half apology, half shrug. There's no time for blame, only surviving. You try to remember your training, but it mostly consists of swing hard and don't die. So you keep swinging, occasionally hitting, mostly missing. Every now and then someone falls. Sometimes they scream. Sometimes they go quiet instantly. You try not to look. This isn't a movie. This is a bar fight at the world's worst tavern with 500 angry men and no one to break it up. And it's just getting started. If you thought medieval battle would sound like the elegant clash of swords and heroic trumpets, you are breathtakingly mistaken, It sounds more like a livestock market colliding with a blacksmith shop during an earthquake. The first thing you notice is the screaming. It's constant, not just from the wounded, though there are plenty of those, but from the living. Men yell to psych themselves up. They yell because they've been stabbed. They yell because someone stepped on their foot, or because they forgot whose side they're on and are now swinging wildly at anything that moves, including Bush. You've got the shrill screams of young lads who should have stayed in the bakery, guttural bellows from big men with axes, and the high-pitched, borderline apologetic whimper of a guy realizing he's wearing the wrong team's colors. Somewhere behind the lines, someone shouting holds the line with all the hope of a man yelling at the tide to stop. No one listens. You can't even hear him. You're too busy dodging weapons and wondering if your left arm always made that clicking sound. Then come the weapons themselves. Swords clang against shields. Maces make a dull, horrifying thump when they connect with something soft, usually a face. Arrows whistle past your ears with a precise sound of regret. Occasionally a spear cracks through armor, and the resulting shriek makes your spine reconsider its commitment to standing upright. But the worst sound, it's not the screaming. It's not even dying. It's the wet sounds. Yes, wet. The squelch of someone stepping in something that used to be a person. The slurp of blood and mud mixing beneath your boots. The squish when someone lands badly and doesn't get up. These aren't sounds you forget. They take up permanent residence in your nightmares. You also hear armor clanking, men crying for their mothers, a horse screaming, which, by the way, is profoundly haunting. And somewhere, unbelievably, someone trying to sing a hymn badly and out of tune. Amid it all, your ears start to ring, not from injury, just overload. You start to operate on instinct because your brain's given up and gone on break, and still the screaming continues. If you're hoping for a cinematic slow-motion ending where you deliver a final monologue before dramatically collapsing, I regret to inform you that's not how this goes. Most people in a medieval battle died unseen, unheard, and from behind, usually by a guy who didn't even know your name. Sometimes it was even someone on your own side. You see, the battlefield is not a polite arena. It's a sweaty, chaotic mosh pit, where everyone sneezes away from a fatal misunderstanding. One minute you're swinging your axe like you mean it. The next thump. Something pierces your back and your knees betray you. You fall forward into the mud with the grace of a collapsing haystack. No one notices. No one has time. There are no final words, no hand to hold. Just you, the dirt, and the very strong suspicion that this could have been avoided if you become a monk. Then there are those taken down by horses, not stabbed, not slashed, trampled. Nothing says ignoble death, quite like becoming one with the soil beneath a panicked warhorse named Buttercup. And let's not forget the friendly fire. Not the kind with explosives, but the kind where a poorly trained militiaman swings a flail in a wide, hopeful arc and accidentally removes your ear or your head. Either way, you're remembered as that guy who stood a bit too close to Jeff. Some fall and are simply left behind. Whether unconscious, injured, or just deeply committed to pretending to be dead, they lie still while boots stomp past. Some of them live, some don't. It all depends on luck, mud, and whether a looter mistakes them for actual cargo. And sometimes it's insultingly random. A slipped foot on blood-soaked grass, a snapped ankle in a hole someone dug to poop in, or getting crushed under a panicked pile of men trying to flee, but going the same direction. In short, medieval death wasn't majestic. It was awkward, undignified, and almost always sudden. Which is why when a man survives, he's not celebrated for his bravery, but for his sheer dumb luck. Movies make them look majestic. Galloping steeds ridden by chivalrous knights, charging nobly into battle like thunder given legs. In reality, horses in medieval combat were less glory machines and more unpredictable battering rams with anxiety issues. When cavalry charges, you don't hear trumpets, you hear rumbling. Not the poetic kind, the kind that makes your ribs vibrate and convinces your lower intestines it's time to evacuate. You glance up and see them, enormous warhorses bearing down at speeds you didn't think possible from something that eats grass for a living. The knights look impressive from afar. Shimmering armor, fluttering banners, and fancy helmets that scream. I paid extra for this, but up close it's just screaming from them, from the horses, from you. Because here's the thing. Horses do not care about your formations. They do not respect personal space, and they do not distinguish between enemy and guy just trying to stay alive if you're in their way. You're going to get flattened into something archaeologists will one day label regretful smear. One man gets run over entirely, disappears beneath hooves, and is never seen again. Another tries to grab a knight's leg, misses, and is kicked in the chest so hard he might now be legally classified as a belle. Some knights fall off. A surprising number, actually. Turns out slippery mud and full plate armor don't mix when they crash. The sound is somewhere between a pantry collapsing and a church bell being punched. They then lie there like confused beetles, flailing and cursing as they try to stand up before someone sticks them with something pointy. I don't think the horses are immune to chaos. One rears up dramatically, gets spooked by a flag, and bolts in the wrong direction, dragging its rider toward the latrines. Another simply refuses to move at all, which results in a shouting match between knight and horse that everyone awkwardly ignores. For infantry, there's only one rule: don't be under the horse. It's a rule everyone learns quickly, often the hard way. By the end, horses are bloodied, men are scattered, and whatever formation existed is now a tragic memory. And the cavalry? They'll probably do it all again tomorrow. At some point in the battle, after the arrows, after the screaming, after you've been accidentally elbowed by at least 3 people on your own side, you fall. It might be from a shove, or tripping over a severed limb, or slipping on the world's slickest combination of blood, bile, and someone's recently spilled breakfast. Doesn't matter how it happens, you're down. And in medieval battle, falling down is not part of the choreography. It's a decision point. You now have about 3 seconds to make a very important choice. Get up and maybe die, or stay down and maybe die. Getting up is bold, noble even. Also incredibly dangerous, because standing up in a battlefield means becoming a very obvious, very upright target in a sea of distractions. You might get speared just for trying. Worse, you might get trampled by your own side, who now view you as battlefield floor texture. On the other hand, staying down isn't exactly safe either. People fall on you. Horses stomp near you. Looters occasionally poke the bodies to see if they're dead or just trying really hard. And if someone figures out you're faking, they might get annoyed and fix the situation permanently. Still, many choose the dead possum method. Lie still, breathe shallow, and pray nobody steps on your spine. You listen to the chaos swirl around you, steel hitting steel, men crying out, the unmistakable wet splat of something ending poorly nearby. A man drops next to you. He doesn't move. You try not to look, and sometimes it works. You survive by being the battlefield's most committed blank. Eventually, the fight moves on, the noise fades, and you're still breathing. Victory. Kind of. The problem is getting back up, because now you're covered in grime, blood, unclear who's, and the subtle shame of surviving by a corpse impersonation. When you do rise, assuming you're not part of a new human pile, you look around, dazed, bent, smelling like a haunted wound. No one cheers. No one notices. You're just another body that didn't stay down, which, by medieval standards, makes you one of the lucky ones. The battle is over. You're not quite sure how it ended. There was no dramatic banner raised, no villainous general shouting retreat as trumpets blared. One moment it was chaos. The next, fewer screams, less clanging, more groaning. That's how you know it's done. The noise shifts from aggressive to exhausted. You look around, blinking through blood, hopefully not yours, and sweat. The field is littered with bodies, weapons, and the occasional boot that's somehow separated from its owner and is now resting politely atop a rock. It's quiet, unsettlingly so. Someone mumbles we won with all the enthusiasm of a man who just found out he gets to live, but only in a tent full of disease. Another guy is yelling victory while clutching his own arm, which is no longer fully attached. You're not in agreement because technically, yes, you are upright, breathing, and mostly unperforated. That is victory. But the truth is, in medieval warfare, victory doesn't mean fanfare. It means not being dead yet. It means dragging your bruised, aching carcass back across the field to the camp, past fallen friends and former enemies, all of whom share the same expression. Really, this is how it ends. There's no celebration, no feast. You might get half a jug of warm ale and some bread that's more weapon than food. A priest mutters prayers over the fallen. A few men search corpses for anything useful. One guy finds a decent pair of boots and declares the day a triumph. Your commander, somehow still clean, makes a speech about bravery and honor. You can't hear it. Your ears are still ringing, and your brain is busy focusing on more important things, like not collapsing. You think about the men who didn't make it. Then you think about your foot, which might be broken. Then you think about Stu and immediately regret it. But you're alive. Filthy, traumatized, possibly concussed, but alive. Which in medieval terms is what they call a resounding success. You sit down on a rock, exhale, and say the same thing every survivor of every medieval battle has ever whispered under their breath. Never again. Then you get called back for another skirmish next week. After the swords are sheathed and the groaning becomes the dominant battlefield soundtrack, it's time for the least glamorous phase of combat cleanup. You might assume this means burying the dead and tending to the wounded. Technically, that's part of it. But really, it's a mix of triage looting and a kind of horrifying medieval arts and crafts project where the materials are body parts. First, the medics arrive. And by medics, we mean men with knives, bad eyesight, and zero formal training. They specialize in phrases like "that'll have to come off" and "bite on this stick." An experienced surgeon might use wine to clean your wound. A less experienced one might drink it first. You sit down with a sword gash on your thigh and the vague hope that it's not fatal. The barber surgeon, yes, the guy who normally trims beards, takes one look and says, "We'll see." Then he pulls out a needle that's been sterilized by waving it near a candle. You do your best not to scream. You fail loudly. Meanwhile, bodies are being dragged into haphazard piles. Some are covered. Most aren't. You recognize a face or two, but you don't linger. The smell is turning spiritual. Flies arrive en masse, excited for the all-you-can-eat buffet. One lands on your open wound. You sweat it, then realize that's probably the cleanest thing you'll experience today. Other soldiers are salvaging equipment, which is a polite word for looting. They rummage through corpses for swords, helmets, shoes, anything not nailed down or still twitching. You don't judge. You do the same. You need new boots, and Gregor doesn't need his anymore. Sorry, Gregor. Some men dig shallow graves. Others light pyres. One guy just sits quietly with a blank stare and a javelin still sticking out of his arm. You try to offer help. He declines. "It's mine now," he mutters. Wounds are bandaged. Some reopen 5 minutes later. Infection. Likely amputation. Probable death. Optional depending on how lucky you feel and whether the flies take an interest. By nightfall, the battlefield has quieted. The living stumble back to camp, covered in mud, blood, and a growing suspicion that the worst is still ahead. And technically, they're right. You've survived. Technically, you've stumbled off the battlefield with all your limbs and just enough brain function to recognize your own boots, which may or may not have belonged to someone else this morning. Now it's time to rest. And by rest, we mean collapse somewhere vaguely dry. Try not to cry. Back in camp, everything smells worse. Somehow the scent of sweat, blood, bad stew, and cooked horse lingers in the air like a curse no one's brave enough to name. You find your spot, a patch of earth less swampy than the rest, and lie down with the grace of a dropped sack of onions. Around you, wounded men groan. Some scream. One sings badly. Another one prays to at least 3 different gods, just to be safe. The soldier nearby is cleaning his blade with his shirt. He's still wearing it. The cook is ladling out what might be food. You approach and receive something in a bowl that is legally not soup, but emotionally still counts. It has the consistency of regret and the color of don't ask. You eat it. You have no shame left. That was lost somewhere between the 5th arrow volley and watching a man get slapped to death by a disoriented warhorse. You try to sleep. It doesn't work. You're too sore, too itchy, and the guy next to you has started snoring with the intensity of a church organ falling down a hill. You shift positions 12 times and end up slightly wetter than when you started. You stare at the stars and wonder what you did wrong in a past life to deserve this one. Occasionally, someone limps in from the darkness, dragging a sword and muttering something about next time. There won't be a next time. There's always a next time. Your commander walks through camp, pretending to look concerned. His armor is still polished. He's not bleeding. You hate him a little more. And yet you're alive. Your body's one massive bruise. Your brain feels like it's been boiled in onion ale. But you made it. This is what passes for downtime in medieval war. Tomorrow, the cleanup continues. Or worse, marching again. Surviving a medieval battle doesn't earn you peace. What it does earn you is a seat around a fire, a lukewarm mug of something vaguely alcoholic, and the right to start rewriting history before your bruise is even finished forming. This is how it always ends. Not with a noble ceremony or a bard singing songs of your heroism. No, it ends with a bunch of filthy, traumatized men sitting on damp logs, trying to one-up each other with stories that get more questionable by the minute. You listen as a man swears he personally took down 6 knights with nothing but a frying pan. Another claims he caught an arrow mid-air and threw it back. Someone else says he faced off with a war elephant. In France, where there are no elephants, you nod, you sip, you lie a little too. In your version, you didn't trip over a corpse and scream. You strategically reposition the part where you try to crawl into a shrub to avoid cavalry. That becomes a stealth maneuver. You skip the moment where you begged a squire to hold your hand during the arrow storm. Because everyone here is doing the same thing, turning trauma into legend. It's not about ego. It's survival. If you can laugh about it, maybe it didn't scar you permanently. If you tell the story well enough, maybe it'll drown out the actual memories. The smell of burnt flesh, the look in a dying man's eyes, the sound of metal hitting bone. By now, someone's roasting a questionable piece of meat and no one's asking questions. Laughter bubbles up, dry and slightly desperate. A man plays a lute that's missing 2 strings. The tune is off, but no one cares. A woman, a camp follower, patches a sleeve and hums like the world outside the fire's glow doesn't exist. You stare into the flames and think you lived through it. Barely, accidentally, miraculously. Soon you'll be on the road again. Off to another fight, another glorious encounter. But for now, there's warmth. There's bread. There's a camaraderie of men who know exactly how much of your story is false, because theirs is too. And for one night, at least, that's enough. Centuries before the Great Wall became a continuous monument slicing across northern China, the landscape was a chaotic checkerboard of kingdoms, each with their own ambitions and anxieties. This was the Warring States period, a time of relentless conflict, when 7 powerful states clawed and bled for dominance over the Chinese heartland. These kingdoms, constantly at odds with one another, had little reason to cooperate. Instead, they raised individual walls, local, makeshift defenses built from tamped earth, stones, and timber. These early fortifications were not part of some grand, unified plan. They were desperate measures, the equivalent of drawing a line in the sand and daring your rival to cross it. More than barriers, they were statements of power. This is mine. Try and take it. But it wasn't just rival kingdoms they feared. To the north, beyond the cultivated fields and river valleys, roamed nomadic tribes. The Xiongnu chief among them, skilled horsemen who moved like ghosts across the steppes, raiding and vanishing before retaliation could even be organized. These raids weren't just inconvenient, they were existential threats. Livestock stolen, villages burned, and trade routes severed. The scattered states had little choice but to try and wall off the wild. The earliest of these regional barriers stretched for miles, but they were fragile. Hastily constructed with rammed earth or layers of brush and mud, some were reinforced with wooden stakes or crude stone blocks, but few were built to last. What they lacked in permanence, they made up for in manpower. Tens of thousands of peasants, conscripts, and prisoners were thrown into the grueling work, often with no choice and no rest. These isolated walls were often poorly maintained, crumbling in the face of time and weather still. They represented the beginning of an idea that China's northern frontier could be tamed not through negotiation or diplomacy, but through sheer will and wall building. No single king envisioned the Great Wall as we know it today. That dream of unification, of a singular barrier stretching across the spine of China, would come later with the rise of an emperor who craved not just power but eternity in stone. And so, amid dust and blood, the groundwork was laid not for a wall, but for a legend. In 221 BCE, after centuries of chaos, a single man did what no one before him had: unite all of China. His name was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. And he didn't just want to rule, he wanted to redefine the landscape itself, where others saw fractured regions stitched together by war. He saw the beginnings of an empire, and to protect it, he needed something colossal. One of his first decrees as emperor was to link and expand the existing regional walls built during the Warring States period. These individual barriers, some already decaying, others barely more than glorified trenches, will be joined into a single massive defense network to keep the nomadic Xiongnu and other northern tribes at bay. But this was no repair job. It was an engineering campaign of imperial scale. Qin's vision was not just about military defense, it was about power, unity, and control. A continuous wall symbolized not just the edge of civilization, but the edge of his personal authority. To build it, he conscripted hundreds of thousand soldiers, peasants, prisoners, and scholars who had run afoul of the regime. Many were worked to death in remote mountain passes or scorching deserts. The wall earned a grim nickname among the people, the longest cemetery on Earth. And yet the sheer scale of the project was unlike anything the world had seen. The materials were brutal and basic, rammed earth packed layer by layer between wooden frames. Workers stomped it down with their feet or pounded it using logs. Where stone was available, it was hauled by brute strength. Tools were primitive. The terrain was merciless. But Qin Shi Huang was relentless. He didn't just build a wall. He built roads, standardized weights and measures, even unified the written script. In his mind, all of it, the roads, the rules, the walls, were part of one project to create order from chaos and leave behind an empire that would last forever. The original Qin wall may not have looked like the iconic stone structures we picture today, but it was the foundation. It was the beginning of a boundary that would rise, fall, and rise again through dynasty after dynasty. And next it would pass into the hands of the Han. After the death of Qin Shi Huang and the swift collapse of the Qin dynasty, many of his sweeping reforms were rolled back, but not the wall, the Han dynasty. 206 BCE, 220 CE, which rose in the Qin's wake, recognized the same eternal truth. China's northern border was never truly secure. And so, rather than abandon the project, the Han emperors doubled down, expanding, strengthening, and redefining the Great Wall. Under Emperor Wu of Han in particular, the wall wasn't just a military barrier. It became the backbone of imperial strategy. The Han launched massive campaigns to push back the Xiongnu, those same nomadic horsemen who had terrorized the north for generations. In doing so, they extended the wall farther than ever before, into regions that would eventually serve as arteries of trade and movement for centuries. The Han didn't just rebuild the Qin walls, they adapted them instead of relying solely on rammed earth. They incorporated bricks, stones, and more sophisticated fortifications where the terrain allowed. Watchtowers were added at intervals, allowing soldiers to spot raiding parties from afar and light signal fires, an early warning system that let news of an attack travel hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. More than a military tool, the Han Wall became a logistical network. Garrison posts, signal towers, and supply depots turned the wall into a functional military road. Troops could move quickly, supplies could be relayed efficiently, and messages could travel with blazing speed by beacon or runner. The Great Wall had become more than a line. It was now a living system of defense. Life along the Han Wall was harsh, but not forgotten. The empire stationed thousands of soldiers and settlers in remote forts, creating a frontier society where families, merchants, and outposts clung to imperial protection. Over time, these lonely stations became small communities, and in their shadows, cultures met. Han Chinese and nomadic tribes trading, mingling, and occasionally clashing in these dusty crossroads. By the end of the Han era, the wall had transformed into something new, not just a line of defense, but a symbol of imperial presence in the vast northern reaches. And yet even the mighty Han could not hold the line forever. Next came chaos, collapse, and eventually a new dynasty with a bold new style of wall building. With the fall of the Han dynasty in 220 CE, China once again unraveled into political disunity and warlordism. What had been a powerful, centralized empire splintered into rival kingdoms during the Three Kingdoms period, followed by centuries of instability. And as the emperors fell, so too did the priority of the Great Wall. Many stretches of the Han and Qin walls crumbled into dust neglect. Erosion and looting took their toll. Station outposts were abandoned. Watchtowers collapsed. In many regions, the wall became less a structure of defense and more a buried memory, half swallowed by shifting sands and creeping vines. Without a strong central government to maintain it, the Great Wall was simply too vast to preserve. But the threats from the north never disappeared. Nomadic powers like the Xianbei, the Rouran, and later the Guk Turks rose and expanded across the steppes. Some of these groups would eventually carve out their own kingdoms within China, blending cultures while redefining borders. The wall in these times was less a hard border and more a relic of an older vision of defense, a line that no longer matched the political reality. Yet fragments of the wall still served local rulers. Some warlords and regional dynasties used leftover segments of the ancient defenses as the skeletons for new fortifications. Others mined the old walls for materials. Bricks and stones were repurposed to build homes, temples, or regional walls of their own. It was a slow cannibalization of a fallen empire's bones. Meanwhile, in the popular imagination, the wall faded. It was no longer an empire-wide project, but a thing of legends and old records. Chinese poets wrote of distant battlegrounds and border fortresses, painting the northern frontier as a cold, bitter place where men went to die and were seldom remembered. Still, even in this time of decay, the idea of the wall remained powerful. It lingered as a symbol of what China had once been and what it could be again, a dream of unity, strength, and clarity in the face of chaos. And that dream would stir once more when a new dynasty, born from military conquest and fueled by ambition, rose from the ashes. The Ming. But first, centuries more would pass. By the time the Ming dynasty came to power in 1368, China had seen centuries of invasion, collapse, and foreign rule. The trauma of Yuan dynasty, ruled by the Mongols, was still fresh. The Mongol armies had thundered through the north and controlled China for nearly a century. When the Ming overthrew them, it wasn't just a political victory, it was a cultural reckoning. And with that came an urgent priority. Never again. The Ming emperors saw the need for a fortified northern barrier, not as symbolic, but as utterly practical, and unlike the earthen ramparts of the Qin or the decentralized garrisons of the Han, the Ming Wall will be something different entirely. Stone, brick, and firepower. Construction began in earnest during the late 1400s and ramped up in the 1500s, particularly under the direction of generals like Qi Jiguang, who saw the wall not only as defense against nomadic Mongol raids, but as a means of projecting Ming control. This was a dynasty that wanted permanence, and it showed they built with quarried stone and kiln-fired bricks. The ramparts were reinforced, drainage systems were added, watchtowers rose at regular intervals, and beacons were installed to send up smoke signals in daylight and flames at night. This was the version of the Great Wall that most people picture today. Massive, winding, iconic. It stretched across mountains, snapped through desert plains, and clung to cliffs like a ribbon of armor. Some parts were as wide as a modern highway. Others rose as high as a 3-story building, and all of it was meant to last. But the wall was more than just military hardware. Along its length, the Ming dynasty built garrison towns, supply depots, and troop housing, creating a parallel society of soldiers, farmers, and administrators who lived and worked in its shadow. The wall wasn't just a line between China and the barbarians. It was a lifeline for the soldiers who defended it, and the empire that depended on it. Still, the Ming Wall wasn't impenetrable. The nomads adapted. Raiders found weak points. Corruption spread among guards. And when the Manchus came, they didn't charge through the wall. They were let in. But before that fall, the Ming had done the impossible. They turned a myth into stone and made the Great Wall truly great. Behind the grandeur of battlements and parapets, the Great Wall was also a place of grit, monotony, and survival. For the thousands of men stationed along its vast length during the Ming Dynasty, life wasn't heroic. It was harsh, cold, and often forgotten by the empire they swore to protect. Soldiers lived in fortified barracks and garrison towns scattered along the wall's spine. These weren't elite troops in polished armor. They were conscripted farmers, criminals, and peasants, men who traded their freedom or futures for a bowl of rice, a pair of boots, and a crude bed behind stone walls. Some served voluntarily, seeking pay or honor. Others were sent as punishment, exiled to the frontier, where winter bit and boredom settled like frost. Each day began with routine patrols, drills, maintaining the wall, hauling supplies. The wall itself constantly needed care. Stones shifted, mortar cracked. Watchtowers required mending. Soldiers repaired what they could with frozen hands, braving sandstorms in the west or blizzards in the north. There were no holidays, only shifts and the distant, ever-present threat of a Mongol raid. Food was simple and often scarce. Millet, beans, and salted meat. Vegetables were grown in small plots where soil allowed. If a raiding party struck a supply caravan, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean starvation. Disease was common. Morale was low. Desertion, despite the punishment of execution, wasn't unheard of. But life wasn't all bleak. Families often accompanied soldiers, creating small, insular communities along the wall. Children were born in its shadow. Merchants traveled between garrisons, trading wine, cloth, and gossip. Some posts even saw cultural blending as nomadic groups and hand settlers intermingled through trade, marriage, or uneasy peace. Then there were the beacon keepers stationed at isolated towers far from any garrison. Their job? To watch the horizon. A column of smoke by day, fire by night. That was the signal. Fast, simple, and terrifying. These men lived alone or in pairs, surrounded by nothing but silence and sky. To live on the Great Wall was to exist between worlds, between empire and wilderness, between myth and reality. These were the invisible lives that kept the wall standing. Not emperors, not generals, just ordinary people with calloused hands and cold feet. And yet, for all their effort, the wall could not hold forever. For centuries, the Great Wall stood as the ultimate symbol of Chinese strength, unyielding stone against shifting sands, empire against the unknown. But walls, no matter how high or thick, are only as strong as the people guarding them. And in the 1600s, that strength cracked not from an outside charge, but from within. By the late Ming Dynasty, corruption had spread like rot through the imperial system. Troops' salaries were delayed or stolen. Supplies vanished before reaching garrisons. The once disciplined soldiers manning the wall were now underpaid, underfed, and overworked. Morale plummeted. Many garrisons turned to smuggling and local trade to survive, often working with the very steppe nomads they were supposed to repel. It was in this weakened state that the Ming faced their greatest threat yet, Manchus, a rising power from the northeast. Unlike earlier nomadic tribes, the Manchus were organized, politically savvy, and just as determined to rule as any Chinese dynasty. They didn't need to storm the wall with fire and fury. All they needed was an open gate. That gate came in 1644, when a Ming general named Wu Sangui made a decision that would change history. Faced with a peasant rebellion that had already seized Beijing, and with his own forces outmatched, Wu opened the Shanghai Pass, one of the most critical entries through the wall to the Manchu army. He hoped they would help suppress the rebellion. Instead, they took the capital and founded a new dynasty, the Qing. In one stroke, the Great Wall's entire purpose collapsed. It had not been conquered. It had been bypassed, betrayed by those it was meant to protect. The wall could not defend against shifting loyalties, desperation, or political convenience. Under the Qing, the Great Wall faded from strategic importance. The empire expanded deep into the north, pushing past the barrier that once marked the edge of civilization. The wall was no longer a frontier. It was a relic, a memory of a different world. And so the Great Wall, which had taken centuries to build, was rendered obsolete in a single moment of human error. No breach, no siege, just a key in the wrong hands. But legends rarely die so easily. After the Manchus took power and the Qing dynasty expanded China's borders well beyond the wall, the once mighty fortification began to fade. Not with a crash, but with a whisper. It was no longer a military necessity. Trade routes bypassed it. New fortresses were built deeper into the frontier, the Great Wall. That colossal symbol of imperial resolve simply became irrelevant. Without purpose, maintenance ceased. The garrisons emptied. Watchtowers were left to crumble. Local villagers scavenged its bricks to build homes, wells, and pig pens. In some places, entire stretches were dismantled stone by stone, not out of malice, but practicality. Why quarry new material when the old walls sat unused? In deserts, sand slowly swallowed sections of it. In the mountains, roots split stones apart and rain washed away mortar. Centuries of storms, earthquakes, and time turned once grand battlements into lopsided ridges and forgotten humps on the horizon. Travelers and poets still spoke of its grandeur, but few cared to visit. For most of the Qing dynasty, the wall was a monument to a bygone age, respected but rarely maintained. It wasn't until the 19th and early 20th centuries, as China struggled with foreign invasion, civil war, and modernization, that the wall began to re-emerge into national consciousness. Foreigners, especially European explorers and scholars, started to arrive with wide eyes and notebooks. They romanticized it. They marveled at it. Some even misunderstood it, believing the entire structure had been built by one emperor, or that it was visible from the moon. By the time the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, the wall had become more than stone. It was a symbol of Chinese identity, endurance, and ingenuity. Mao Zedong famously said, "He who has not climbed the Great Wall is not a true man," turning it from a ruin into a patriotic rite of passage. In the late 20th century, restoration projects began, particularly near Beijing. Tourists flocked to sites like Badaling, where the wall was reconstructed to its Ming glory. Other sections, wild, broken, and authentic, remained untouched, slowly succumbing to nature. From forgotten ruin to global icon, the Great Wall had completed a strange journey. No longer a barrier of defense, it had become a bridge to the past, a reminder of what people can build when driven by fear, ambition, and dreams that stretch across centuries. The Great Wall of China is one of the most recognized structures on Earth, yet much of what people know about it is wrapped in myth and exaggeration. Contrary to popular belief, it's not a single wall, but a network of fortifications built by different dynasties over 2,000 years, stretching through mountains, deserts, and plains. It doesn't form an unbroken line. And no, it's not visible from the moon, but the truth is far more fascinating. The wall is less about stone and mortar, and more about memory and metaphor. It represents a civilization's long struggle to define itself, not just against outsiders, but against the chaos within. It tells a story of emperors obsessed with order, of peasants forced into backbreaking labor, of generals whose legacy was measured not in victories, but in feat of construction. It's the product of ambition so great it left a scar visible from the sky. Throughout Chinese history, the wall has meant different things to different people. To emperors, it was a symbol of control. To soldiers, it was a prison of duty. To poets, it was a lonely place, echoing with the wind and the weight of separation. And to modern China, it has become a cultural anchor, a reminder of endurance, strength, and national pride. Tourists come by the millions, hiking restored paths, and posing beside ancient watchtowers. They're drawn not just to the view, but to the myth. The idea that human hands could shape something so vast, so defiant. It would outlast kingdoms, dynasties, even time itself. And in many ways it has. Yet large portions of the wall remain in ruins. Over 30% has already disappeared, eroded, or dismantled. Preservation is now a race against weather, development, and neglect. The challenge today is not to build a wall, but to remember and protect what remains, to preserve a past that stretches over continents and centuries. In the end, the Great Wall was never truly about keeping enemies out. It was about drawing a line between civilization and wilderness, between empire and uncertainty, between what was known and what was feared. And in doing so, it became something greater than defense. It became a legend. Stone by stone, story by story, the wall still stands, not just in the hills of northern China, but in the imagination of the world. The year was 1860, and America was a country on the brink of both greatness and collapse, with a rumble of civil war on the horizon. And gold fever grips California. One thing was painfully clear. The United States was growing faster than its communication lines could keep up. The East Coast was buzzing with telegram wires and railroads. But the West? It might as well have been another continent. Sending a letter from Joseph Mo to Sacramento, California, could take 3 to 4 weeks on a good day. That was, of course, assuming the stagecoaches weren't held up by snow bandits, or the casual collapse of a rickety bridge. And in a country obsessed with manifest destiny, waiting a month to hear if your shipment of gold had made it or whether Lincoln had been nominated was unacceptable. The government had tried alternatives, steamships around Cape Horn or via the Panama Isthmus, both risky, expensive, and painfully slow. But the West needed real-time updates, not news that was already outdated by the time it arrived. What the country needed was speed, and preferably something that didn't involve a 6-month cruise around South America. Enter the Pony Express, a bold, reckless, and some might say wildly impractical idea. The concept was simple. Put a chain of young, lightweight riders on horseback, racing day and night across nearly 2,000 miles of rugged terrain. Relay stations would be placed every 1,015 miles. Fresh horses swapped in minutes, and no one stopped. Rain, snow, or arrows be damned. Letters would now travel from Missouri to California in under 10 days. It sounded crazy, but then again, so did building a transcontinental railroad. And look how that turned out. This wasn't just about delivering mail. It was about proving that the American frontier could be conquered with grit, courage, and a lot of saddle sores. It was about shrinking a sprawling, chaotic country into something that felt just a little more connected. And at the center of it all stood a ragtag team of businessmen, teenage riders, and weary station masters about to make history on horseback. But as fast as it rose, the Pony Express would soon find itself racing against something it couldn't outrun, the speed of light itself. The brains behind the Pony Express weren't wild cowboys or government officials. They were businessmen, ruthless, ambitious, and maybe a little desperate. William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell were already knee-deep in the overland freight business. They ran supply lines to army posts across the West, hauling everything from barrels of flour to military cannons through Indian Territory and barren plains. But contracts were drying up, and the economy was shaky. So they did what all great capitalists do when cornered. They gambled. Their new plan: launch the fastest mail service in American history and land a juicy government deal to make it profitable. They called it the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, which, let's be honest, doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. The newspapers and public quickly gave it a more thrilling name: Pony Express. This wasn't just a logistical venture, it was an all-out sprint across hell. The route stretched nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, cutting through the unforgiving heart of the American wilderness. There were mountain passes in the Rockies that swallowed wagon trains whole, and deserts in Nevada where horses could collapse within hours. Yet Russell and company were convinced they could make it work. They built over 150 relay stations, hired about 80 riders, and bought 400 of the toughest, fastest ponies money could buy. Their first goal was symbolic: deliver Lincoln's inaugural address to California in record time. The plan was a PR stunt, but also a challenge to the telegraph and the stagecoach, two giants of 19th century communication. They launched the inaugural ride on April 3, 1860. A crowd gathered in St. Joseph to watch the first rider bolt out of town with a mail pouch slung over his saddle. Cheers erupted. A legend was born. Behind the scenes, the company was hemorrhaging money. Stations had to be manned, horses fed, riders paid, and equipment constantly replaced. But no one cared about the books yet. All eyes were on the trail. Could this audacious experiment actually work? What followed wasn't just fast. It was a blur of courage, chaos, and wild improvisation. Riders raced through blizzards, dodged ambushes, and sometimes crossed rivers or still frozen over. They weren't just carrying mail, they were carrying the promise of a united country. And for a brief, shining moment, it worked. The Pony Express had one major requirement for its riders. They had to be young, really young, ideally orphans. That way, if they died on the trail, no one would complain too loudly. Charming, right? The typical rider was between 14 and 20 years old, weighing no more than 125 pounds. The lighter the boy, the faster the horse. That's famously called for skinny, wiry fellows not over 18 orphans preferred. It was part job offer, part dare. And the ones who answered were a special breed, reckless, stubborn, and wired for speed. Among the most legendary was William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later become a Wild West icon. Though there's debate about how much he actually rode for the Express, the image of a teenage Cody charging through hostile territory with nothing but a revolver and a mail pouch helped fuel the mythos. Then there was Pony Bob Haslam, who completed one of the longest and most dangerous rides in Express history. 120 miles through Paiute territory, with fresh arrows sticking out of his shoulder. These weren't just delivery boys, they were adrenaline junkies. Riders galloped through sleet and sandstorms, often riding day and night with little rest. They carried a modular saddlebag designed to be easily tossed between horses, which held the sacred cargo of about 20 pounds of letters, tightly packed and sealed in oilskin to protect against the elements. Every second mattered. Riders changed horses roughly every 10 to 15 miles, pausing only long enough to throw the mochila over a fresh saddle and gulp some water. Each rider would cover 75 to 100 miles in a single stretch, then collapse at a home station for food and rest, and then they'd do it all over again. Dangers lurked at every turn. Bandits, wild animals, river crossings, and attacks by hostile groups defending their lands from intrusion. The Express didn't carry weapons of war, but every rider had a revolver, a knife, and a lot of nerve. They rode alone through the night, often with no company except for the sound of hooves and the wind. Despite the danger, the Pony Express rarely failed to deliver. The mail got through almost always, and in those fleeting 18 months, these teenage daredevils became legends, living, breathing symbols of American tenacity. While the riders got the glory, it was the network of relay stations, about 157 of them, that made the Pony Express work. Without them, there would have been no heroic dashes, number 10-day record times, and certainly no letters reaching Sacramento unscathed. These stations were the unsung heroes, scattered roughly every 10 to 15 miles across deserts, plains, and mountain passes like tiny islands of civilization. In an ocean of wilderness, there were two main types: relay stations and home stations. Relay stations were simple affairs, bare-bones structures where a rider would swap out their exhausted horse for a fresh one. The exchange was a pit stop in the purest sense, often completed in under 2 minutes. Picture it: a kid barely old enough to vote, galloping in at full speed, flinging the mochila onto a waiting saddle, and bolting off again in a cloud of dust. Home stations were spaced about every 75 to 100 miles and served as the rider's resting point. Here the young men could eat, sleep, and attempt to recover before heading out again. These were often operated by station keepers and their families, living in isolated cabins or sod houses with little more than a fireplace and a sense of duty. Mail delivery depended on them. A missed horse, a closed gate, or a sleepy attendant could cause hours of delay, and that was unacceptable. Life at these stations wasn't glamorous. Supplies were scarce. Stations in the high desert or deep plains had to fend off raids, survive brutal winters, and deal with wildlife ranging from rattlesnakes to wolves. Station keepers often lived with a rifle within arm's reach and slept with one eye open. And yet the system worked most of the time. Horses were strategically placed. Riders followed strict timetables. Each station served as a heartbeat in the grand circulatory system of the Pony Express. Miss a beat, and the whole organism suffered. But when it all clicked, it was magic. Messages that once took weeks suddenly arrived in 9 or 10 days. A letter sent from New York could pass through dozens of hands, hundreds of hooves, and across a continent's worth of peril, and still arrive ahead of schedule. The system was bold, fragile, and breathtakingly efficient, but it was also expensive. And now it was time to pay the bill. The Pony Express was fast, blazingly, unbelievably fast for its time. But speed came at a cost, and not just in risk, sweat, or the occasional horse that dropped dead mid-route. The cost was very real, very financial, and very unsustainable. From the very beginning, the Pony Express bled money. Operating across 1,800 miles of harsh terrain required enormous resources. Just building the infrastructure, stations, barns, corrals, and supply depots cost the founders around $200,000 a fortune in 1860. Then there were the horses, hundreds of them, each bred for speed and endurance, not longevity. And of course, the riders and station workers all had to be paid. Barely. Each letter cost the customer $5 for half an ounce in the beginning. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $170 today, just to send a short message. Even when the price eventually dropped to $1, it was still out of reach for most Americans. The service was used mostly for urgent government or business correspondence. Think Wall Street, not Grandma's birthday card. Despite all the daring, all the glory, the Pony Express was never a profitable enterprise. The founders, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, had banked on securing a lucrative government mail contract. But that deal never came. The U.S. Post Office was reluctant to fund what many saw as a dangerous stunt, and political instability in the lead-up to the Civil War didn't help matters. By late 1860, the financial strain became unbearable. Horses needed feeding, stations required constant upkeep, riders had to be replaced, and all of this was funded out of pocket. Worse, the public perception of the Express as a kind of romantic adventure masked the brutal reality. It was a logistical nightmare running on borrowed time. Then came the knockout punch. In October 1861, the Transcontinental Telegraph was completed. Suddenly, a message could travel coast to coast in mere seconds. No horses, no riders, no risk. Just dots and dashes over a wire. It was the future. Cold, efficient, and utterly unstoppable. 2 days after the telegraph line opened, the Pony Express shut down. 18 months. That's all it lasted. But in that short span, it became legend. And not because it made money, but because it proved something bolder, that America could outpace its obstacles. On October 24, 1861, a tiny but deafening revolution clicked into place across America. The final link of the Transcontinental Telegraph was completed, connecting the East Coast with the West for the first time in history by wire. With that one moment, the very thing the Pony Express had been designed to solve, speedy cross-country communication, was rendered obsolete. Messages that once took 10 days by horse could now be transmitted in minutes. It wasn't glamorous. There were no charging stallions or heroic riders racing through blizzards, just trained telegraph operators tapping out Morse code into buzzing machines. But it worked, and it worked better than anyone expected. For the Pony Express, it was like trying to outrun lightning. You could be the fastest courier alive, but you couldn't beat the raw efficiency of electricity traveling down a copper wire. 2 days after that telegraph line was completed, the Pony Express officially folded. No dramatic finale, no farewell ride, just silence. Ironically, the same silence left behind after the last Morse signal went out each night. For Russell, Majors, and Waddell, it was a financial disaster. They had poured everything into the business, hoping to secure that elusive government contract. But the government, now enamored with the telegraph, saw little use for a horse-based mail system. The company was dissolved, its assets sold off, and its founders faded into bankruptcy or obscurity. And yet, for all its speed and progress, the telegraph didn't inspire the same kind of emotional resonance. You couldn't paint it in heroic brushstrokes. There were no ballads about clicking dots and dashes. The Pony Express, despite its failure, had the better story. Its riders became legends. Their exploits were retold in dime novels, stage plays, and eventually Western films. Even Buffalo Bill, whose actual involvement with the Express was likely exaggerated, built an entire career on the back of that legend, touring the world as a symbol of Wild West courage. So while the Telegraph won the race, the Pony Express won the myth. It represented a final gasp of old world adventure before America truly became wired, mechanized, and modern. Though the Pony Express galloped into history in just 18 months, its legend would outlive its brief lifespan by more than a century. Almost immediately after its shutdown, writers, journalists, and showmen began turning it into a myth, a romantic tale of danger, speed, and rugged American spirit. The truth was already impressive, but the truth wasn't enough. The public wanted something larger than life, so stories began to stretch. Riders were said to outrun native raiders, leap across canyons, and survive days without water. Historians raised an eyebrow for readers. They bought the dime novels by the wagon load. No one capitalized on this better than Buffalo Bill Cody. Though his actual time with the Pony Express remains murky, if it happened at all, Cody saw an opportunity in his traveling Wild West show. Cody reenacted thrilling Pony Express rides before cheering crowds in Europe and across the United States. Kids grew up idolizing the image of a lone rider braving the wilderness, a sack of urgent letters slung across his back. By the late 19th century, the Pony Express had become more than a failed mail service. It had become a national symbol of frontier bravery, a manifest destiny, of a time when a single teenager on a Mustang could carry the weight of the nation's communication on his shoulders. Towns along the original route started commemorating the stations. Statues were built, plaques were placed. In Estee, Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California, historical markers proudly declared, "Here began the Pony Express." School children were taught about the riders like they were founding fathers on horseback, and Hollywood, of course, came galloping in. Silent films, TV shows, and westerns featured exaggerated but lovable versions of the Express, often ignoring how brutal, short-lived, and economically disastrous the real thing had been. Still, the romantic appeal endured. And maybe it's because the Pony Express tapped into something timeless. The idea that sheer determination and grit could overcome impossible odds, that youth and courage still mattered. That in the face of technology, there was still space for the human spirit to shine, if only briefly. So even as the telegraph wires hummed overhead and later telephone lines and satellites followed, the image of a young rider tearing across the plains never quite faded from the American imagination. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail. It delivered a myth, a blueprint, a rugged silhouette of what Americans wanted to believe about themselves. In a country stitched together by ambition and risk, it became the perfect story. Bold, brief, tragic, and full of speed. At its heart, the Pony Express captured a uniquely American fantasy that one individual with enough courage and determination could carry the burden of a vast nation on their back. A teenage rider braving storms and arrows symbolized not just frontier grit, but youthful defiance against the impossible. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about heart. As the 20th century dawned and America entered the industrial age, that cowboy on a mission energy became a kind of nostalgic fuel. Railroads might have spanned a continent, and telegraphs might have connected cities in milliseconds, but those machines lacked soul. The Pony Express was the last time communication felt human, urgent, and heroic. It was the last romantic gasp before wires and gears replaced muscle and sweat. Politically, the story of the Pony Express was also convenient. It painted the expansion westward as noble and exhilarating, rather than messy, violent, or exploitative. Schoolbooks taught it as a triumph of courage, not a story of risky capital investment or conflict with indigenous peoples in this way. The Pony Express helped launder the more uncomfortable parts of American expansion into a feel-good narrative. A teenager galloping through the desert is easier to celebrate than a land dispute or a bankrupt freight company. Still, that doesn't diminish its impact. It proved that the West could be connected, that distance could be conquered. And even though the Express failed financially, it helped pave the way, literally and figuratively, for the infrastructure that would follow the telegraph, the railroad, the transcontinental highway. In a way, the Express was America's awkward teenage phase. Bold ideas, clumsy execution, high ideals, a few broken bones along the way. It was a short-lived miracle that set the stage for something bigger. And even now, When modern communication happens with a tap, there's still something stirring about a lone horseman galloping into the unknown, because somewhere, buried deep in the dust, is the reminder that progress once came on four legs and runners. On October 26, 1861, just 2 days after the transcontinental telegraph line went live, the last Pony Express rider galloped into Sacramento. There were no fireworks, no farewell parade, just a quiet end to one of the boldest communication experiments in American history. It was over just like that. But that final ride wasn't a failure. In fact, it was a victory lap. The Express had done its job. It had proven that a country as wide and wild as the United States could be connected quickly, reliably, and with human tenacity. Even though it was replaced by the flicker of telegraph signals, Pony Express had set a standard. Urgency, bravery, and daring could still matter in a world of wires and machines. In the decades that followed, the Pony Express became almost mythological. Statues of galloping riders were raised in town squares. Reenactments were performed every July. Postal stamps commemorated its brief, breathless run. And historians, sometimes amused, sometimes in awe, continue to revisit those 18 months that changed how America imagined itself. It's easy to forget how fragile the whole thing was. Letters were carried in lightweight pouches that couldn't pass between riders in seconds. Horses were trained to run full tilt over cliffs, rivers, and mountains. Riders were barely old enough to grow a beard. There were ambushes, stampedes, and snowstorms. And still, against all odds, most of the mail made it on time. The Express also left behind something more subtle, a template for how Americans would view risk and reward. Silicon Valley founders and Wall Street gamblers often talk about Pony Express energy, bold moves made fast with the odds stacked against you. It's still used as a metaphor for trying something insane just because it might work, even if it doesn't. Today, when you send a message across the planet in a second, it's hard to grasp what 10 days on horseback meant. But that's the point. The Pony Express isn't remembered because it lasted. It's remembered because it tried. For one brief shining moment, a bunch of kids on horseback outran the world. And though they were eventually passed by the telegraph, telephone, and the internet, they did what few ventures ever do. They made history, and then they became legends. And that, more than speed, is what made the Pony Express unforgettable before the violin found its place beneath the chins of concertmasters and soloists. Before it filled opera houses and sonatas with aching emotion, it lived many lives under many names. Its story begins not in Italy, but far earlier, in the vast wind-swept grasslands of Central Asia. Here, centuries ago, horsehair was strung across simple wooden bows to stroke the strings of instruments like the morincourt and the rebab. These early bowed instruments used by nomadic herders produced low nasal tones that mimicked the human voice or the sounds of the animals they lived alongside. The idea was revolutionary, using friction rather than plucking or striking to sustain a note. It was the birth of an expressive technique that would echo across cultures. As trade routes flourished, these instruments moved westward along the Silk Road, through Persia, into the Arab world, and eventually into southern Europe, the rebab in particular. It was carried into Moorish Spain during the 8th and 9th centuries, where it mingled with local traditions. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire developed the lyra, another bowed instrument that would later influence Eastern European designs. Each culture added something, different tuning, a new shape, and extra string. These instruments didn't evolve in a straight line. They branched like a family tree in medieval Europe. The rebab gave rise to the viol, and the fiddle, boxy, bowed instruments held against the chest or tucked under the chin. These were the tools of wandering minstrels and church musicians playing simple melodies in taverns, streets, and courtly halls. Their sound was raw but intimate, their construction basic but clever. The bow had arrived, and with it a new way of thinking about music, not as a sequence of short notes, but as a flowing, continuous voice. But these early fiddles were still crude compared to what was to come. Their shapes varied wildly. Their tuning was inconsistent. There was no standard form, no refined soundboard, no fingerboard optimized for agility. Still, in their wavering tones and handmade quirks, the violin's soul was beginning to stir. The concept was there, the desire for something more agile, more emotional, more human. It was just waiting for the right hands, in the right place, the right time. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Europe found itself awash in new ideas about art, science, and music. Among cathedrals and courts, a quiet transformation was taking place. The rough-hewn fiddles and viols of earlier centuries were being refined not only in appearance, but in purpose. Instruments were no longer just for dancing or liturgical drones. They were becoming vehicles for expression. By the 15th century, bowed string instruments had become common throughout Western Europe. You could hear them in taverns, weddings, noble chambers, and theaters, but no two looked quite the same. The viol often had 5 strings, and its shape varied wildly from maker to maker. The lira da braccio, an Italian favorite, had a broad body and flat bridge, making it ideal for playing courts. Popular with Renaissance poets and humanists who liked their verses set to music. But despite their growing popularity, these instruments still had limitations. Their sound lacked projection. The tuning systems were unreliable. Their design was too clumsy for true virtuosity. Musicians and composers began asking for more flexibility, more range, more clarity, more responsiveness. Something that could sing like a voice, yet dance like a flute. At the same time, a quiet revolution was happening in instrument-making craftsmanship. Artisans across Italy and Germany were experimenting with curved wood, new varnishes, and more precise carving tools. They weren't just shaping wood, they were shaping resonance. Luthiers began to understand that the shape and thickness of the wood dramatically affected the sound it produced. Thinner tops vibrated better. Rounded backs projected further. Arched bridges allowed for individual string playing. Musical tastes were evolving too. Composers began writing more intricate parts for bowed instruments. The demand wasn't just for rhythm or harmony, it was for melody, for something lyrical and soloistic. The stage was being set for a new type of instrument to emerge, one that was compact, agile, and expressive. Europe had all the ingredients, the centuries-old lineage of bowed instruments, the artistic energy of the Renaissance, and a new class of master builders ready to carve out the future. All that was missing was someone bold enough to reimagine the instrument from the ground up, and in the small Italian town of Cremona that someone was about to pick up a chisel in the fertile plains of northern Italy, nestled along the Po River, lies the unassuming town of Cremona. During the 16th century, it was neither a capital nor a military power, but it was home to something else entirely, craftsmanship at its finest. This was a place where guilds of builders, artisans, and instrument makers turned into miracles. And it was here that the violin, as we recognize it today, was truly born. At the center of this quiet revolution stood Andrea Amati, a master luthier whose innovations would define an entire family of instruments. Building on the lira da braccio and other Renaissance fiddles, Amati streamlined the body shape, refined the arched top and back, and standardized the proportions. His creations weren't experiments, they were templates. He introduced the F-shaped sound holes, which allowed better sound projection and helped stabilize the structure. His instruments were smaller, lighter, and more responsive than anything before. And importantly, he tuned them in perfect fits, a tuning system that gave the violin its uniquely vocal and agile range. By the mid-1500s, Amati's violins were being commissioned by royalty, including King Charles, the Queen of France, who ordered a set of 24 instruments for his court. These weren't just musical tools, they were status symbols, hand-painted and gilded, blending engineering and visual art. Cremona quickly became the epicenter of violin-making excellence. Other families followed the Amati tradition, most notably the Guarneri and Stradivari dynasties. They didn't just copy Amati, they refined, stretched, and deepened his vision. The violins coming out of Cremona were no longer anonymous workshop items. They were signed works of genius, each with its own tone and soul. Why Cremona? Some say it was the quality of the maple and spruce available nearby. Others point to the climate, perfect for drying wood slowly and evenly. Still others credit the tight-knit guild culture, where techniques were passed down through apprenticeships and secrets, never written, always spoken. Whatever the reason, Cremona became to violins what Florence was to painting a birthplace of brilliance from these narrow cobblestone streets. An instrument emerged that could whisper or weep, leap or lament, an instrument that would go on to shape centuries of music across Europe and beyond. By the early 17th century, the violin had outgrown its birthplace. No longer confined to the luthier shops of Cremona, it began to travel from court to court, chapel to chapel, and across the borders of Renaissance Europe. And with each journey, it gained power, prestige, and purpose. Italy, of course, remained the heart of violin culture. Composers like Claudio Monteverdi were among the first to feature the violin in formal compositions. In Monteverdi's Orfeo 1607, widely considered the first great opera, violins were used not just for accompaniment, but to express mood, emotion, and divine grandeur. The instrument was no longer a rustic fiddler tool. It was a theatrical voice, capable of seduction, sorrow, and triumph. Soon Italian violinists and instrument makers carried their craft abroad. They moved to Germany, Austria, and France, where royal courts were eager to embrace the latest musical fashions. The violin became a fixture in chamber ensembles, prized for its clarity and brilliance. In Paris, the royal court of Louis XIV adopted it enthusiastically. The Sun King. It even had an official 24-member violin band, the Les Van Cater Violin du Roi, a powerful endorsement of the instrument's rising status. Meanwhile, Germany and Austria began developing their own schools of violin playing and construction. Makers like Jacob Steiner gave the instrument a broader, deeper body, favoring a warmer tone over the sharp brilliance of the Italian designs of violinists such as Heinrich Bieber. Pushed the instrument's technical boundaries, writing demanding solo works filled with ornamentation and emotional complexity. Churches, too, embraced the violin. It accompanied choirs, filled stone cathedrals with soaring melodies, and took part in sacred oratorios. No longer considered too sensual or secular, it was now accepted into the highest realms of spiritual music by the end of the 17th century. The violin had become more than a curiosity. It was essential to composers, to performers, and to audiences. It was equally at home in a smoky tavern, a royal ball, or a candlelit cathedral. And it wasn't done yet. Next came the golden age of violin making, and the rise of a name that would become synonymous with perfection. Antonio Stradivari. If Andrea Amati gave birth to the violin, Antonio Stradivari perfected it. Born in Cremona in 1644, Stradivari was trained in the tradition of the Amati workshop, but he quickly moved beyond imitation. What he created in the late 17th and early 18th centuries would become the gold standard, not just of violins, but of musical craftsmanship itself. Stradivari's instruments weren't merely beautiful, they were transcendent with a keen eye for wood selection, subtle asymmetry, and shaping, and a still mysterious varnish that added depth both visually and sonically. Stradivari violins possessed a tone that was clear, powerful, and hauntingly warm. They could project to the back of a concert hall, yet whisper intimately to a single listener. Stradivari built over 1,000 instruments in his lifetime. Violins, violas, cellos, and even guitars. About 650 survive today, each one named like royalty. The Messiah, the Soil, the Lady Blunt. Many are still played by the world's greatest soloists. Even centuries later, their sound remains unmatched. Some scientists have tried to unlock the Stradivarius secret by scanning the wood, analyzing the varnish, or modeling the acoustics. But the truth is, no one can fully replicate what he did. What made his work so exceptional? Part of it was the wood. Slow-growing alpine spruce for the top plate and flamed maple for the back, aged to near perfection. But much of it was Stradivari's meticulous adjustments, minute alterations to thickness, arching, and shape that gave each instrument its unique character. During his lifetime, Stradivari's fame spread far beyond Cremona. Kings, dukes, and virtuosos sought his instruments. His workshop became legendary. Even after his death in 1737, musicians regarded a Stradivarius as the ultimate prize, a tool so responsive it felt alive. Stradivari wasn't the only great luthier of his time. The Guarneri family, especially Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, produced violins with darker, more aggressive tones, favored by soloists like Paganini. But Stradivari's name endured as a myth. His instruments, like relics from a divine era of sound making. The golden age of violin making had peaked, and from this point forward, the violin would move from the hands of makers to the stage, into the era of virtuosos who would stretch it and the human spirit to its limits. By the 18th century, the violin had fully evolved from a supporting voice into a starring role. It no longer just filled in harmonies or lead dance rhythms. It began to speak as if endowed with a personality of its own, And in the hands of a new breed of performers, the virtuosos, the violin became an instrument of one of the earliest stars was Arcangelo Corelli, whose elegant and expressive sonatas helped define the violin's role in Baroque music. He wasn't a flashy showman, but his playing was admired for its grace and control. His compositions laid the groundwork for generations of violinists, emphasizing phrasing, tone, and structure. Then came Antonio Vivaldi, the Red Priest of Venice. A fiery composer and performer, Vivaldi wrote over 230 violin concertos, most famously the Four Seasons. These pieces weren't just music, they were theatrical experiences filled with imitations of birdsong, thunderstorms, and pastoral dances. Vivaldi showed the world that the violin could not only sing, it could tell stories. As musical taste shifted toward the classical era, the violin remained at the forefront. Composers like Mozart and Beethoven wrote violin sonatas and concertos that demanded nuance, speed, and deep emotional intelligence. The violinist was no longer just a technician. They had to be a storyteller and a dancer, moving with the orchestra and breathing life into every phrase. But it was in the early 19th century that the idea of the violinist as a mythic figure reached its peak, thanks to Niccolò Paganini. With his gaunt appearance, supernatural stage presence, and seemingly impossible technique, Paganini was more than a musician. He was a phenomenon. Audiences whispered that he had made a deal with the devil. His fingers flew across the strings in dizzying displays of double stops, harmonics, and left-hand pizzicato. His 24 caprices for solo violin remain a towering Everest for modern players. Paganini changed everything. After him, violin playing would never be the same. He elevated the instrument's celebrity and ushered in an age where soloists were as revered as kings. With every bow stroke, the violin was no longer just an instrument. It was a voice, sometimes divine, sometimes demonic, always unforgettable. As the violin grew in power and prestige through the 18th and 19th centuries, it also became the cornerstone of the orchestra. Once a companion to singers and lutes, the violin now led the charge. Melodic, expressive, and versatile, it became the instrument composers relied on to carry their grandest ideas. The transformation began with the Baroque orchestra, where strings already formed the foundation violin sections first and second emerged to provide harmony and melody. Composers like Bach and Handel gave the violin prominent roles in their concertos and orchestral suites, but it was still part of an ensemble identity. There were no massive string sections yet, just tight, intimate groups. Then came the classical era, and everything expanded. Composers such as Haydn and Mozart shaped the modern symphony, and the violin took center stage. Haydn, often called the father of the symphony, built rich, balanced orchestral textures with violins as the melodic engine. Mozart went further, giving violins delicate, soaring lines and treating them with tenderness and agility. In his symphonies, the violin could be playful, tragic, or divine, all within a few measures. But it was Beethoven who truly transformed the orchestra. He expanded its size, deepened its emotional range, and placed unprecedented demands on every section, especially the strings. The first violins often carry the primary themes, while the second violins played crucial harmonic and rhythmic roles. No longer background players, they were now the narrators of symphonic drama. By the Romantic era, orchestras had ballooned in size and the violin was king. Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, and others gave the violin lush melodies and heroic passages, both in symphonies and concertos. The orchestral violinist had to master nuance, endurance, and ensemble coordination, all while keeping up with rapidly evolving musical complexity. Conductors too began relying on the concertmaster, the lead violinist, not just to lead the section, but to bridge the gap between conductor and orchestra. In many ways, the concertmaster became second in command, responsible for tuning, bowings, and setting the tone for the entire ensemble. From chamber groups to 100-piece orchestras, the violin had woven itself into the very DNA of Western art music. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was the voice of the symphony itself. By the 20th century, the violin had long since conquered Europe's concert halls, but its journey was far from over. No longer confined to the symphony or opera pit, the violin began to cross borders and genres, weaving its voice into cultures far beyond its Italian roots. In Eastern Europe, the violin had already taken on a vibrant, expressive role in Romani gypsy music, long before it was ever featured in Tchaikovsky or Brahms. In Romani hands, the violin danced, cried, and dazzled with virtuosic flourishes and heartbreaking melodies. It became a voice of resistance and celebration, passed down through oral tradition, not conservatory instruction. Across the Atlantic, the violin transformed again into the fiddle. In American folk, Appalachian, and bluegrass music, the violin shed its aristocratic clothing and put on worn boots. It became a communal instrument, leading barn dances, storytelling through reels and jigs. Its style changed too. Quick, rhythmic bowing, open tunings, and spontaneous improvisation took center stage. In India, the violin found an entirely new identity. Adapted into Carnatic and Hindustani classical music, it was played seated, resting on the floor, the scroll angled toward the player's ankle. Indian violinists mastered microtones, slides, and ornamentations foreign to Western ears, yet perfectly suited to raga and tala. The instrument had crossed a cultural bridge and become something uniquely Indian. Meanwhile, in Latin America, the violin flourished in mariachi bands and folk ensembles. In Argentina, it danced alongside the bandoneon in the smoky world of tango. In Mexico, it serenaded with soaring lines over trumpets and guitars. Everywhere it went, the violin adapted, not by dominating, but by listening and blending. Jazz took the violin yet another step forward. In the 1930s and 40s, players like Stéphane Grappelli turned the instrument into a swinging, playful lead voice in the hot club of France. Later, Jean-Luc Ponty and Regina Carter redefined the violin for fusion and modern jazz, proving it could groove, bend, and improvise with the best of them. By the 21st century, the violin had become a global citizen. It could speak any musical language: classical, jazz, folk, experimental. Its voice could be lush or raw, precise or wild, and still, through every transformation, it remained unmistakably itself. In today's world, the violin stands at a fascinating crossroads, a timeless instrument in a rapidly changing age. It still holds its throne in orchestras, concert halls, and conservatories. Yet it also thrives in genres and places the old masters could never have imagined. Its voice, haunting, human, endlessly adaptable, continues to echo across continents and cultures. In classical music, the violin remains essential. Young prodigies dazzle on global stages, playing concertos written centuries ago with fresh emotion and technical brilliance. International competitions like the Queen Elizabeth or the Menuhin launch careers, and keep the classical tradition alive and fiercely competitive. But there's a shift happening. More players are challenging tradition, pushing the boundaries of what the violin can be. Contemporary composers are writing for the violin in new ways, using extended techniques, electronics, loops, and non-Western tunings. The violin isn't just singing anymore. It's scratching, whispering, shrieking, tapping. It can mimic machines, birds, or pure chaos. In the hands of boundary pushers like Hilary Hahn, Patricia Kapuscinskaya, and Curtis Stewart, the violin became a laboratory of sound. Meanwhile, technology is reshaping how we interact with the instrument. Electric violins, once a novelty, are now common in pop, rock, and experimental music. Artists like Lindsey Stirling blend choreography, EDM, and cinematic themes into viral violin performances that reach millions online. It's a reminder that the instrument's appeal isn't just sonic. It's visual, emotional, personal. Education, too, is evolving. With YouTube tutorials, online masterclasses, and digital sheet music, the violin is more accessible than ever. A student in Nairobi or Lima can learn from a Juilliard professor at the tap of a screen. But alongside this democratization comes a challenge: how to preserve depth and discipline in a world obsessed with speed. Still, through all the noise, the violin endures. Why? Because it is, and always has been, an extension of the human voice. It cries like we do. It sings like we wish we could. And whether it's played on a creaky stage, a subway platform, or in front of 10 million subscribers, the violin still has the power to stop time. Only for a moment. Delicate yet defiant, ancient yet evolving, the violin isn't just an instrument. It's a storyteller, and its story is still being written.